Chapter 1. The Small Island That Dreamed Big. Long before the maps bore the name Britain, before kings were crowned and towers of stone pierced the sky, there was simply an island. A vast green land rising from the restless embrace of the surrounding seas. To those who lived upon it, it was not one place, but many. Each valley, each forest, each wind-swept moor was its own small world. The rivers carved their paths through soft earth and jagged stone, and along their banks life stirred, ancient and enduring. The people of this land were many and varied. They spoke in tongues as old as the hills themselves, languages shaped by the breath of the earth and the whisper of the trees. In the north, among the mist-cloaked highlands and deep lochs, fierce tribes gathered around firelit circles, their warriors painted in blue, their legends carried on the wind. To the south, where the land softened into rolling hills and fertile plains, other peoples made their homes, Celts and Britons, whose stories danced with the spirits of earth and sky. These were not kingdoms as we might know them now, but fragile alliances, ever shifting. Warlords rose and fell. Each tribe guarded its lands with a fierce, possessive love, seeing in the forests not just timber, but the bones of their ancestors. In the rivers, not just water, but the lifeblood of their gods. The island was a tapestry, woven of countless threads, rich in beauty, but brittle in unity. And beneath this patchwork of peoples, the land itself seemed to breathe. There was a waiting, deep in the soil, in the bones of the earth. A sense that a story was stirring, not yet written. The island dreamed, though its dream was for a future it could not yet glimpse. The tribes knew the tides of fortune could shift with a single moon's passing. They fought and traded, loved and grieved as all people do, but none yet imagined that one day these many voices would find a single song. For now, they were many, separate, watching the horizon, and beyond that horizon, across the steel-grey waves, a new chapter was preparing to arrive. One carried by the wind and the sea. The coming of the Northmen, it began as whispers, rumors caught in the spray of the sea. Strange ships, long and lean, shaped like the bones of sea serpents, had been spotted along distant shores. The men who sailed them were fierce and wild-eyed, their hair bleached by salt and sun. They came from the frozen lands of the north, where night stretched long and winter spoke in storms. When the Northmen came to Britain, they did not announce themselves with treaties or heralds. They came with the dawn, their sails like the wings of ravens. The longships cut through the mist of the rivers, gliding with an eerie grace, and with them came the clash of axes against shield, the cries of the hunted, and the acrid scent of burning that marked their path. Villages that had stood for generations were swallowed by flame. Stone altars toppled, wooden halls reduced to ash. Yet the Norsemen were not mindless raiders. Though they brought death, they also brought something else, a mingling of worlds. Among the spoils of their raids were not only gold and cattle, but words and stories. New gods' names were whispered beside the old, Norse blood mixed with British, forging lineages that would outlive the Axes. In time, many Northmen stayed. They settled the lands they had once scoured, building homes where ashes had cooled. In the Danelaw, the swath of Britain, they came to rule. The rhythms of life shifted. New customs intertwined with ancient rites. A child might grow, speaking both the tongue of their Norse father and the song-like language of their British mother. A market might sell goods from both worlds, side by side. The land, once only British, became something more layered. Every field ploughed by these newcomers carried with it a history of fire and renewal. The soil remembered both the blood spilled and the seeds sown. Yet beneath the surface of this uneasy coexistence, tension smouldered. The Northmen were powerful, and their reach grew with each passing season. To many native rulers, it seemed the island itself might soon slip from their grasp. But amid the turmoil, one man, a king in name, though not yet in power, would rise from the shadows to shape the island's fate. A king in the marshes. His name was Alfred. History would come to call him the Great, but in those dark days, he was little more than a fugitive. The Viking tide had risen high, drowning one kingdom after another. Alfred's own Wessex, once a proud realm, had been broken. The Norse armies swept across the land like wildfire, leaving smouldering ruin in their wake. Forced to flee, Alfred sought refuge not in grand halls or fortified keeps, but in the marshes of Somerset, a land of reeds and water, half submerged and wild. Here, in the damp embrace of the fens, the defeated king found himself stripped of all but resolve. The crown was gone, the throne lost, yet within his heart a flicker of hope remained. In the stillness of the marshes, Alfred waited. The days were hard, filled with hunger and damp, the constant threat of discovery hanging over every moment. Yet it was here, amid the mud and mist, that Alfred's vision sharpened. He saw beyond the shattered kingdoms of the present. He dreamed of a unified land, a realm where Norse and Briton alike might find peace under one banner. Legend tells of a moment when, weary and distracted, Alfred allowed cakes baking over a fire to burn. The tale is often told to show his humility, yet beneath it lies a deeper truth. Even kings are shaped by trial. In the marshes, Alfred learned patience, resilience, and the quiet strength of endurance. As winter gave way to spring, the tide of fate began to shift. Alfred rallied what few loyal forces remained. From the reeds and shadows emerged a hardened band of warriors, led not by a desperate fugitive, but by a king reborn. With cunning and courage, Alfred struck back, not with overwhelming force, but with precision and resolve. Victory was not swift, nor was it total, but each small triumph laid the foundation for something greater. The Norsemen, once unstoppable, found themselves facing an enemy they could not easily crush. Alfred's resilience inspired his people. The dream of a unified land, once faint and fragile, began to take root. Toward one kingdom, the path toward unity was long and fraught with peril. Even as Alfred secured peace in Wessex, the rest of the island remained a mosaic of divided lands. The Danelaw persisted, a Norse domain within British soil. Other kingdoms rose and fell, their banners changing with the seasons. Yet beneath the surface of war and treaty, a deeper change was stirring. Alfred's vision did not die with him. His son, Edward the Elder, continued the struggle, expanding the reach of Wessex. His daughter, Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians, became a warrior queen, leading armies and fortifying towns. Their efforts were not born of simple conquest, but of a deeper purpose, to weave the scattered threads of the island into one fabric. Gradually, the idea of England, not merely a collection of tribes or petty kingdoms, but a single realm, began to take hold. It was a dream carried by word and deed, by the hard-won alliances forged in the fires of conflict. Battles were fought not only with sword and shield, but with marriage and law, with language and shared purpose. The Norse too became part of this evolving story. Many settled permanently, their descendants calling England home. The blood of conquerors and natives mingled, crafting a new identity that was neither wholly one nor the other. In this way, The pain of the past became the seed of a richer future. By the time Edward's successors claimed the title King of the English, the island's face had changed. Though conflict still simmered, the vision of a united England had taken firm root. The small island that once dreamed in fragments had begun to dream as one. And though countless chapters remained unwritten, of conquest, of kings and queens, of empire and loss, the first stirrings of that great story had begun. From the marshes of Somerset to the halls of Winchester, from Norse longships to English law codes, the island had started its long journey toward unity. The spirit of the land that once whispered in scattered valleys now spoke with a growing voice. England was becoming more than a place. It was becoming an idea, and that idea would shape the centuries to come. Chapter 2: Beyond the Pale. The Conquest of Ireland. Target word count: 2,000 words. An unquiet neighbour. Ireland lay beyond the pale of England's reach, an emerald island whose hills whispered old stories and whose people clung to ways shaped by centuries of tradition. The land itself seemed alive. Rivers curved through green valleys. Mountains rose like ancient guardians. In the forests and glens, the past and present mingled. It was a place where legends still walked with men. The Irish people lived in a world apart. Their land was divided into many small kingdoms, each ruled by its own tribal king. These rulers were warriors and poets alike, protectors of both their people and their culture. Alliances shifted with the seasons. Feuds flared and faded. Yet in the heart of it all beat a fierce love for the island they called home. To the east, across the cold waters of the Irish Sea, another power stirred. In England, the crown had grown strong. Its kings dreamed of more, of lands to claim, of banners flying over distant shores, and as those restless ambitions spread, they looked toward Ireland. It was close. It was rich in land and spirit, and it stood apart, proud and free. At first, the two islands had watched one another from afar, but borders are like thin ice. Under pressure, they crack. England's gaze fell more heavily upon Ireland. The kings of England saw not an island of poetry and legend, but one of opportunity, and soon, the quiet sea between them would churn with sails and soldiers. The invasion of Henry II. In the year 1171, the winds of history shifted. Henry II, King of England, set his sights on Ireland. His reasons were many. Some were political, some personal. But beneath them all was a simple truth. He wished to extend his power. Ireland, fractured into rival kingdoms, seemed ripe for the taking. Henry's opportunity came when an exiled Irish king, Dermot MacMurrough, sought his help. In exchange for military aid, Dermot offered loyalty and a foothold on Irish soil. Henry agreed. Soon, Norman knights crossed the sea, fierce and well-armed. They were not simply warriors. They were builders of castles, enforcers of new laws, and they brought with them the weight of English ambition. Their arrival marked the beginning of great change. The first landings came at Waterford. The ships, tall and proud, seemed to rise from the mist as they approached the shore. On board were knights clad in mail, their swords gleaming, but they also carried something less visible: fear, both ancient and new. Fear of the unknown, fear of resistance. The conquest was not swift, nor was it certain. The Irish kings fought, back with courage and cunning. Their warriors knew the land well, its forests, its bogs, its hidden paths. Battles were fierce, and victories were never guaranteed. Yet, slowly, the English presence grew. Fortresses rose where woods had stood. Laws unfamiliar to the Irish were declared. Henry himself crossed to Ireland, bringing with him more ships and more men. At Waterford, he was welcomed by some, wary and watching. His goal was not only military conquest, but also political control. He sought to bring the Irish kings under his rule, not by sword alone, but through treaties and oaths. Yet these promises, written and spoken, were fragile things. The Irish landscape, ancient and knowing, watched in silence. Trees that had stood for centuries bore witness to this turning point. The rivers carried whispers of change, and beneath the green fields the earth held its breath. The cloak of the church power wears many robes. For Henry, one of the most useful was that of the church. In 1171, a crucial moment came. The English crown received the blessing of the Pope to rule over Ireland. This was no simple favour. It was a calculated move, giving the conquest a cloak of righteousness. With the church's backing, the invasion gained new weight. It was no longer just a king's ambition. It was framed as a holy mission. The English claimed they sought to bring order and proper faith to Ireland. They spoke of guiding the Irish people toward a better path. Yet beneath this veneer of piety lay the sharp edges of conquest. For many Irish people, this new authority felt both foreign and forced. The church in Ireland had its own deep roots, shaped by local traditions and saints beloved for generations. Now, English bishops were placed in key positions. New laws governed old lands. The rituals of faith remained, but the spirit behind them grew uneasy. The blending of power and religion brought centuries of tension. The English crown used its church-sanctioned authority to justify its rule, but true peace remained elusive. The Irish spirit, shaped by both faith and freedom, resisted. In the countryside, away from the fortified towns, the old ways endured. Songs were sung in the Irish tongue. Stories of ancient heroes passed from one generation to the next. The church's blessing might have gilded the crown, but it could not quiet the land beneath. What began in 1171 would echo through the ages. The union of sword and cross planted wounds that would not easily heal. And though the English banner now flew over parts of Ireland, beneath it, the island's heart still beat its own steady rhythm. Seeds of rebellion conquest does not erase spirit. It may bruise it, bend it, even bury it for a time. But in Ireland, the spirit of the people endured. The seeds of rebellion were sown not only in battlefields, but in quieter places, in poems, in songs, in the stubborn memory of freedom. Throughout the land, the bards sang. Their words carried stories older than any king, older than the invaders' banners. Tales of Cú Chulainn and other heroes reminded the Irish that they were a people with deep roots. These stories were not just entertainment, they were resistance in song. In the fields and villages, life went on. Farmers tilled soil watered by both rain and blood. Children learned the language of their ancestors. And always, beneath the surface, the longing for freedom remained. Rebellion came in waves, sometimes open, sometimes hidden. Irish chieftains would rise, gathering clans beneath their banners. There were victories, brief and bright, and defeats, heavy with sorrow. Yet each act of resistance fed the roots of national pride. English rule tried to reshape Ireland. Laws were passed to limit Irish customs. The Pale, a fortified area around Dublin, became the heart of English authority. Beyond its borders, however, Irish culture thrived. To be beyond the Pale meant to be free of foreign rule, at least in spirit. Over the centuries, the seeds of rebellion would grow. Some would blossom in great uprisings. Others would endure quietly in homes and hearts. The struggle was not only for land, but for identity, for the right to speak one's language, sing one's songs, live one's history. And so, while kings and conquerors changed, the island remained. Its hills still whispered old songs. Its rivers still carried the voices of the past. Ireland had been bruised, yes, but it had not been broken. The dream of freedom, planted in the deep soil of memory, would wait patiently for the day it would rise again. Chapter 3: Iron and Stone, the Subjugation of Wales. To the west of England, beyond rolling hills and deep rivers, lay a land like no other, Wales. It was a country where mountains wore veils of mist and legends seemed to live within every valley. The wind carried songs older than memory. Here, the past was not forgotten. It walked alongside the present. The people of Wales were shaped by their land. They lived in villages tucked between steep hills, where life was hard, but rich, with meaning. The mountains protected them, and the sea provided a restless boundary. This was a land of storytellers, bards who kept the history of their people alive through song and verse. Dragons soared through their tales, and heroes of old still fought in the minds of children. The Welsh spoke a language of poetry. It flowed with a rhythm that echoed the streams and rivers running through their valleys. Their culture was deep and proud. They honored the land and each other. Loyalty ran through families and tribes like the roots of an ancient oak. But to outsiders, Wales seemed a puzzle. It was not one united kingdom, but a collection of smaller realms, each ruled by its own lord or prince. Alliances shifted as quickly as the mountain weather. Yet in times of threat, the Welsh could stand together, bound by their fierce love of their land. To rule such a place would take more than force. It would require an understanding of its spirit, something few conquerors possessed. Yet across the border, one king believed that stone walls and steel swords would be enough. The king's ambition, Edward the Friar of England, was a man driven by purpose. Cold and calculating, he viewed the world through the lens of power. Where others saw the beauty of Wales, Edward saw an opportunity and a threat. A land beyond his control was, in his mind, a danger that could not be allowed to stand. By the late 13th century, Edward had already strengthened his rule over England. Now, his gaze turned westward. The princes of Wales had long resisted English influence. Though often divided, they remained proud and defiant. Edward was determined to change that. He prepared carefully. His armies were well trained and heavily armed. Supplies were gathered. Roads were built to support the march of thousands. This was no reckless raid. It was a campaign of conquest, planned with precision. In 1277, Edward launched his first major invasion. His forces crossed the border with ironclad purpose. Along the way, they encountered fierce resistance. The Welsh knew their land well. They fought from the shadows, striking quickly and vanishing into the hills. But Edward was relentless. He used his superior numbers and resources to grind down opposition. Fortresses fell. Territories were claimed. Some Welsh lords submitted to avoid destruction. Others fought on, knowing the cost. By 1282, tensions erupted again. Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the last true Prince of Wales, led a renewed resistance. His cause inspired many, but the odds were grim. Edward's second invasion was even larger, even more ruthless. Valleys that once echoed with harp songs now rang with the clash of arms. Villages burned, families fled. Llywelyn was killed in battle. His death marked the end of native Welsh rule. Edward had won, but the victory was not complete. Every valley seemed to whisper of the price to come. The mountains still stood, and within them the spirit of Wales endured. Castles that never sleep conquest alone was not enough for Edward. He sought to make his victory permanent, to leave a mark that could not be ignored. And so he turned to stone. Across northern Wales, Edward ordered the construction of mighty castles. These were not simple fortresses. They were masterpieces of military engineering and symbols of dominance. Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech and Beaumaris rose from the earth like the bones of giants. The building of these castles was swift and costly. Thousands of labourers toiled under harsh conditions. Stone was quarried and shaped with care. Walls thick enough to withstand siege engines were erected. Towers soared into the sky, their banners fluttering in the Welsh wind. Caernarfon Castle was perhaps the most grand. Its design echoed the walls of Constantinople, a message that Edward's rule was mighty and meant to last. Here Edward's son was born and declared the first English Prince of Wales, a title meant to replace the legacy of the native princes. Conwy Castle stood atop a rocky outcrop, its towers watching over the river below. Harlech Castle, perched on a cliff, seemed to defy nature itself. These were castles that never slept. Garrisoned with English soldiers, they projected power across the land. For the Welsh, these castles were a constant reminder of loss. They cast long shadows, both literal and symbolic. Yet even as stone replaced forest and soldiers replaced shepherds, the people did not forget who they were. Songs mourned the fallen, poems told of old glories and whispered of futures yet to come. The castles might hold the land, but they could not capture the soul of Wales, a spirit that endures. Though the English crown ruled Wales, its spirit remained unconquered. The land itself seemed to remember. The mountains still stood watch. The rivers still sang their ancient songs. And within the hearts of the Welsh people, a deeper sovereignty lived on. The Welsh language endured. It was spoken in homes, sung in gatherings, and passed from one generation to the next. Even as English laws were imposed, the old tongue remained a bridge to the past. To speak Welsh was an act of quiet defiance, a way of holding on to identity. Music, too, carried the spirit of the nation. The harp, an instrument woven into Welsh culture, filled the air with melodies that spoke of love, loss, and resilience. The bards, keepers of history and hope, continued their work. Through verse and song, they ensured that the stories of Wales would not fade. Over time, rebellions would rise and fall. Owain Glyndwr, in the early 15th century, would lead a great uprising, once more igniting the hope of freedom. Though ultimately unsuccessful, his legacy inspired generations. Even in the face of continued English control, Welsh culture thrived in ways that could not be measured by crowns or castles. It lived in the land, in the people's hearts, in the stories they told and retold. Empires may conquer territory. They may build walls and pass laws, but culture remembers. It endures in the quiet moments. A mother teaching her child a song, an elder recounting tales of heroes past, a community gathering to share music beneath a starlit sky. And so it was in Wales. The iron and stone of Edward's conquest may have shaped the land's surface, but beneath it, something deeper remained. Unbroken, unbowed, eternal. Chapter 4. The 100-Year Struggle. Some wars fade quickly. Others cast long shadows over generations. The 100 Years' War was one of these, a conflict that would draw England into a century of battles, alliances, and bitter lessons. It began with a crown, but it soon became a struggle for identity. The seeds of the war were planted in royal blood. For centuries, the kings of England had held lands in France. Their right to these lands came through family ties, through centuries of shifting marriages and inheritances. Yet this connection was always uneasy. Though English kings were sovereign at home, they remained vassals to the French king for their continental lands, a bitter arrangement that bred resentment. In 1328, the French king, Charles IV, died, without a direct male heir. The French nobility chose Philip VI as the new king. But across the Channel, Edward III of England had his own claim. Through his mother, Isabella of France, Edward believed he had the right to the French throne. The French crown rejected this. Pride wounded and ambition inflamed, Edward prepared for war. In 1337, Edward formally laid claim to the French crown. His declaration was more than a personal challenge. It was a national call to arms. The English people were stirred by a sense of destiny, of rightful conquest. Yet they could not know that this war would stretch across the lives of their children and grandchildren. England's identity became tied to the conflict. Victory in France meant more than land. It was a chance to prove the strength of the English crown, to stand as an equal or superior to its greatest rival. As ships crossed the Channel and armies marched, England embarked on a struggle that would shape its history in ways no one yet imagined. Chivalry and carnage. The early years of the war were marked by daring raids and swift victories. The English army, smaller and more mobile, relied on a powerful new weapon, the longbow. This simple yet deadly bow allowed common archers to strike down even the finest knights. It would soon redefine medieval warfare. In 1346, at the Battle of Crecy, Edward III led an English force against a much larger French army. The battlefield was soaked with rain, the ground churned to mud. As French knights advanced, English longbowmen unleashed volleys of arrows. The sky darkened with their flight. Horses fell. Knights stumbled. The flower of French chivalry was broken in the mud of Crecy. This victory stunned Europe. The longbow had shattered the old image of knightly warfare. Glory no longer belonged only to the mounted noble. The common archer had changed the rules. Yet for all the talk of honor and bravery, the reality of war was harsh. After each battle came the grim work of burying the dead. Fields of mud and blood remained where once banners had flown. Villages burned. Civilians suffered. The romance of chivalry could not hide the stench of death. Decades later, in 1415, England would again taste triumph at Agincourt. Henry V, facing overwhelming odds, led a weary English force into battle. Rain once more turned the field to mire. French knights charged, only to be trapped in the narrow space. English arrows flew with deadly precision. The result was a slaughter. Agincourt became a symbol of English pride. Chroniclers sang of Henry's courage, of the valiant yeoman who had humbled a mighty foe, yet beneath the songs lay sorrow. Thousands lay dead. Families in both England and France mourned. Through these battles, England learned a dual lesson: that courage and discipline could overcome greater numbers, but also that war brought deep, lasting pain, the price of glory. As the war dragged on, its cost grew heavy. Victories had brought fame, but maintaining the fight drained England's strength. The royal treasury struggled to keep pace. Taxes were raised again and again. Common people bore the burden. Every village knew the war. Sons marched off to fight and often did not return. Fields lay untended as men were called to arms. families wept for lost fathers and brothers. The war touched rich and poor alike. Even the royal house was not spared. Edward III's later years were marked by decline. His once great court grew weak. His son, the famed Black Prince, died young. The line of succession wavered. Richard II, still a child when crowned, faced a kingdom weary from war. At sea, England struggled to maintain control. French and Allied ships raided English coasts. Merchants feared to sail. The economy faltered. The cost of glory was measured not just in gold, but in hunger and fear. By the early 15th century, England rallied under Henry V. His victories, including Agincourt, revived hopes, but the tide soon turned. The French, inspired by leaders like Joan of Arc, began to reclaim their lands. The dream of an English France faded. Each lost town, each retreat, deepened the wounds at home. The war that had once promised greatness now seemed an endless drain. Parliament grew restless. The people demanded peace. In 1453, the 100 Years' War came to a close. England retained only Calais. The grand ambition of ruling France was gone. The kingdom had gained military renown, but had paid dearly. Its treasury was exhausted. Its people were tired. Its crown, once strong, now sat uneasy upon the throne. England emerged from the war a changed nation, proud but deeply scarred, turning inward. With the war's end, England faced new questions. Who would lead a weary kingdom? What future remained after so much blood had been shed? The long gaze outward now turned inward. The royal line was divided. Rival branches of the Plantagenet family eyed the throne. Ambition, sharpened by years of war, flared into conflict. The Wars of the Roses would soon follow, a bitter civil struggle that would plunge England into fresh turmoil. Yet in this moment, between wars, the land breathed a quiet sigh. Soldiers returned home if they could. Fields were sown again. The bells of peace, though faint, rang once more. For the common people, the end of the war offered hope of normal life. But memories of loss lingered. Every village had its empty chairs. Every family bore the weight of absence. The 100 Years' War had shaped England's sense of itself. No longer merely a feudal realm, it had become a nation forged in endurance and sacrifice. The English saw themselves as a people who could stand against the might of Europe, but also as a people who had suffered greatly for that pride. As the kingdom looked inward, its leaders pondered new paths. Overseas adventure had brought glory and ruin alike. Now, the English crown would seek to strengthen its hold at home. Yet the hunger for power beyond the seas had not died. In time, England's gaze would shift again, this time to lands even farther away. The age of empire lay ahead. But for now, England mourned. The 100-year struggle had ended, leaving behind a land marked by memory, by loss, and by the quiet resilience of those who endured. Chapter 5: Roses and Thorns. There are times in a nation's story when the crown ceases to symbolize unity and instead becomes the prize of ambition. So it was in England during the Wars of the Roses, a time when royal blood stained the soil of the homeland. What had begun as disputes within the halls of power soon spilled across the fields and streets, turning neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. The conflict was rooted in dynastic claims, yet its causes ran deeper. Years of war with France had drained England's treasury and spirit. The long shadow of the 100 Years' War had left the monarchy fragile and the nobility restless. Weak kings and uncertain succession created a power vacuum. Into this storm stepped two great houses, Lancaster and York. Both trace their right to the throne through the descendants of Edward III. Their symbols, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, would come to mark a bitter and bloody struggle. What began as a battle among nobles soon drew in the entire realm. Armies formed not from distant mercenaries, but from Englishmen, farmers, tradesmen, sons of every town and shire. The war was not constant, but episodic, flaring with sudden violence. Battles like Towton in 1461, one of the bloodiest ever, fought on English soil, showed the depths of the nation's division. In snow and sleet, tens of thousands clashed. The dead lay in drifts upon the field, the river said to run red with blood. Through each shift of fortune, the crown passed back and forth, a fragile thing, carried by force rather than consensus. Kings ruled, but were not secure. Each monarch knew that behind every oath could lie betrayal. The wars would last 3 decades, their scars etched into the hearts of those who survived. England's fields, once places of harvest, had become battlegrounds, the very symbol of the realm. Its crown lay in tatters, a prize fought over in an age of ambition and blood. Brother against brother civil war carries a cruelty that foreign wars do not. When the enemy is not some distant land but one's own neighbour, when loyalty is divided not by language or culture but by mere choice, the wounds it leaves are deep and lasting. In the Wars of the Roses, England faced itself. Villages were split, families were torn apart, brothers stood on opposite sides of battlefields, each fighting beneath a different banner. Trust, once a bond among kin and community, became a rare and fragile thing. The lines between loyalty and survival blurred. Nobles shifted allegiance as fortunes changed. One day a man fought for Lancaster, the next for York. Those who hesitated could find themselves stripped of lands, title, or life. For common folk, the war brought ruin. Armies moved across the countryside, taking what they needed: food, shelter, men for service. Fields were trampled, homes burned, and lives upended. In such times, even a peaceful harvest could turn to despair overnight. In court and council, whispers ruled. No one was truly safe. Paranoia spread like a fever. Spies, real and imagined, filled the halls of power. Kings looked over their shoulders. Nobles kept daggers close. Perhaps no moment captured this bitter truth more than the fates of Edward IV's own family. His brother George, Duke of Clarence, once an ally, fell into conspiracy and rebellion. Condemned by his own kin, he met his, and not in battle, but within the walls of the Tower of London. Legend claims he was drowned in a butt of wine, a fitting, if grim, symbol of the warped loyalties of the age. Such tales remind us, civil war leaves no untouched soul. The deepest wounds are those inflicted by family. And in the England of the Roses, every heart carried scars. The rise of the Tudors. Out of the chaos, a new power emerged. The House of Tudor, a family of Welsh and English blood, would bring a fragile peace to a battered land. At the heart of this rise was Henry Tudor. Born in exile and claim only half secure, he seemed an unlikely heir to England's crown. Yet as the wars wore on, exhaustion gripped the realm. The people, weary of shifting kings and endless battles, longed for stability. Into this longing stepped Henry. In 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, fate turned. Henry's forces met those of King Richard III, a ruler whose reign was shadowed by suspicion. The battle was hard fought, but at its climax, Richard fell. His crown, legend says, was found beneath a hawthorn bush and placed upon Henry's head. Thus ended the Wars of the Roses. With Henry VII's coronation, a new chapter began. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the rival houses, symbolized a desire for reconciliation. The red and white rose entwined became the Tudor rose, an emblem of hoped-for unity. But Henry was no naive peacemaker. The lessons of war shaped his rule. He governed with caution and control, mindful always of the ambitions that had torn the realm apart. His court was one of order, but also of suspicion. Rebellions were swiftly crushed. Potential rivals met grim ends. Yet amid this vigilance, Henry laid the foundations of a more stable monarchy. He strengthened royal finances, curbed the power of over-mighty nobles, and began to restore the dignity of the crown. His reign marked not only the end of war, but the beginning of a more centralized and controlled England. The Tudor dynasty, born from blood and caution, would shape the age to come, an age where peace and ambition would walk side by side. Dreams of peace, hints of empire. With the Tudors came a desire for peace. After decades of war, England longed to heal, yet beneath this hope stirred new ambitions, dreams that reached beyond the island's shores. The sea, once a boundary, now whispered of distant lands and untold riches. Tales of exploration and discovery reached English ears. Spain and Portugal had begun to chart the oceans. Their ships returned laden with gold and spices. England, though slower to the chase, felt the pull of empire. Henry VII encouraged cautious ventures. Merchants and navigators supported by the crown began to look outward. John Cabot, an Italian explorer sailing under the English flag, reached the shores of North America in 1497. Though no great colonies yet sprang forth, the voyage marked a turning, a sign that England's gaze was shifting toward the wider world. At home, stability returned. The economy recovered. Towns bustled. Trade expanded. The wounds of civil war began to heal. Though the memory of brother fighting, brother lingered in every village, the court of Henry VII, though restrained, fostered a culture of learning and quiet ambition. His son, the future Henry VIII, grew in this atmosphere, a prince of strong will and restless energy. Under his reign, the dreams of empire would take clearer form. For now, England stood at a threshold. The Wars of the Roses had taught hard lessons. That unchecked ambition led to ruin, that stability required careful rule. Yet they had also forged a new strength. The crown, once fragile, had regained its authority, and the sea, vast and beckoning, called to the nation's restless spirit. In the quiet after war, the first notes of an imperial song began to sound. A new age was on the horizon. Chapter 6. The Sea is Calling. Target word. Count 2,000 words. The promise of the West. There are moments in history when the winds seem to whisper of new possibilities. So it was in the age of the Tudors, when the sea became more than a boundary, it became a promise. Across the restless waters of the Atlantic, rumours swirled of lands unseen by European eyes, of kingdoms rich in gold, of vast territories waiting to be claimed. For England, long confined by old rivalries and civil wars, this call of the sea was irresistible. The dawn of the 16th century brought a world that seemed to be expanding. The Spanish and Portuguese, bold and swift, had already begun to chart new courses. Their ships returned with treasures beyond imagining. Spices from the Indies, silver from the New World. Tales of civilizations both wondrous and strange. In England, merchants, mariners, and monarchs alike watched these developments with growing hunger. The Tudors, now firmly on the throne, saw the sea as a path to renewed greatness. The Wars of the Roses were behind them. The kingdom was healing, but peace at home stirred ambition abroad. England had missed the earliest voyages of exploration. Now it sought to catch up. In the bustling ports of Bristol and London, ships were being built and sailors trained. The sea promised not only wealth but a chance for England to claim its place among the great powers of Europe. The Atlantic, vast and mysterious, seemed no longer a barrier but an open road. Among those who dreamed of sailing west was an Italian navigator named Giovanni Caboto, known in England as John Cabot. Under the patronage of King Henry VII, he would lead a voyage that, though modest in its results, would mark the beginning of England's long journey toward empire. The winds carried more than ships. They carried stories, hopes, and the first stirrings of a destiny that would one day reshape the world. The Voyages of John Cabot. John Cabot was not a conqueror. He carried no army, bore no grand title. He was a mariner, skilled, curious, and driven by the possibilities of the unknown. Born in Italy, Cabot brought to England the spirit of the age of exploration. Where others saw an edge to the map, he saw a gateway. In 1496, Cabot received a royal charter from Henry VII. The king, cautious yet intrigued, granted him the right to seek new lands across the Atlantic. Unlike Spain, which pursued conquest and conversion, England's ambitions were at first more tentative. The crown sought new trade routes, opportunities for commerce, and a chance to expand its reach without provoking immediate conflict with its powerful rivals. Cabot prepared a small ship, the Matthew, and gathered a modest crew. The voyage was not one of overwhelming resources or royal fanfare. It was a quiet gamble, a test of both skill and fortune. In the early summer of 1497, the Matthew slipped out of Bristol, its sails catching the wind. The journey westward was fraught with uncertainty. The Atlantic was vast, its moods unpredictable. Yet Cabot and his crew pressed on, guided by the stars and their resolve. After weeks at sea, land was sighted. Cabot had reached the shores of North America, likely the coast of present-day Newfoundland. His landfall was cautious. The goal was not immediate colonization, but exploration. The forests stretched before them, silent and unfamiliar. The waters teemed with fish. Somewhere beyond the trees, the presence of native peoples was felt. Though contact was limited, Cabot planted a flag and claimed the land for the English crown. His discovery was not the conquest of a rich empire, nor did it yield gold or spices. Yet, it was a beginning. Cabot had shown that England too could touch the New World. When he returned to England, he was welcomed with quiet approval. The voyage had proven the possibility of transatlantic navigation. It had whispered of new paths for an old kingdom. Though Cabot's subsequent expeditions remain shadowed by uncertainty, his first landing had planted a seed, one that would grow in the decades to come. Newfound lands. The lands that Cabot glimpsed were no gilded cities. There were no treasures awaiting swift plunder. Instead, he found a world of cold shores, dense forests, and waters alive with fish. The air carried the scent of pine and salt. The land, though modest in its immediate offerings, was rich in potential. Newfoundland, as the English would come to call it, was a place of stark beauty. The coastline, rugged and broken, gave way to vast woodlands. Rivers carved silent paths inland. The sea itself was a treasure. The fishing grounds of the North Atlantic would prove a source of great wealth in time. Cabot's landing was brief, his contact with native peoples cautious. The inhabitants of this land, skilled hunters and fishers, watched from a distance. Their lives, shaped by the rhythms of nature, would soon feel the first ripples of a distant empire's gaze. For now, the English presence was a mere footprint. No settlers arrived in Cabot's wake. No great fleets followed immediately. Yet the significance of the voyage lay not in its scale, but in its symbolism. England had crossed the sea. It had planted a flag in the New World. The possibility of expansion, once a distant dream, now lay within reach. In England, news of the voyage stirred imaginations. Merchants saw new markets. Navigators pondered new routes. The monarchy, though cautious, recognized the potential. The era of exploration was no longer the domain of Iberian powers alone. England had joined the quest, however humbly. Cabot's journey marked a turning point. It was a first step, small, uncertain, yet profound. The flag he planted would not fade. The lands he touched would become part of a larger story, one that would unfold across centuries. A future, unfolding. As the tides carried Cabot's ships home, they also carried with them a new idea, that England need not be bound by its island shores. The sea, once a realm of fear and limitation, had become a highway to possibility. In the years that followed, the momentum of exploration grew slowly but steadily. Other nations still dominated the early age of empire, but England's mariners watched and learned. Each returning ship from foreign lands brought tales of riches, new peoples, and uncharted coasts. These stories seeped into the English imagination, shaping the ambitions of a generation. The Tudor court, mindful of both opportunity and caution, supported further ventures. Though the great waves of colonization were yet to come, the foundations were being laid. The sea had become a canvas upon which England would soon paint its imperial dreams. In coastal towns, shipwrights honed their craft. Navigators charted new courses. The merchant class began to see the ocean as a source of wealth and power. And beneath it all, the idea of England as a global player took root. The New World remained distant and mysterious, but each tide seemed to bring it closer. The promise of the West had become part of England's vision. No longer content to look only inward, the nation began to dream outward. In time, this dream would lead to great voyages, to settlements, to an empire upon which the sun would one day be said never to set. But in these early days, it began quietly. With the winds of ambition, the courage of mariners, and the simple, profound truth that the world had grown larger, and England with it. As the sea whispered to the hearts of England's sailors and kings, the age of empire was stirring. The journey had only begun. Chapter 7, The King's Great Matter, Target Word. Count, 2,000 words. A marriage without heir. History often turns on the grand sweep of armies and empires, yet sometimes it pivots on the quiet longings of a single heart. Such was the case with England in the early 16th century, when one man's personal desire would ripple outward to reshape the nation and its place in the wider world. That man was King Henry VIII, young, proud, and deeply aware of his royal lineage. Henry was crowned with great promise. Yet beneath the surface of his reign lay a singular concern, the future of the Tudor line. For all his wealth and power, Henry lacked the one thing he believed essential: a male heir. His marriage, To Catherine of Aragon had been politically wise. The daughter of Spain's powerful monarchs, she brought prestige and alliance. In their early years together, the union seemed strong, but fate was unkind. Of the children born to them, only a daughter, Mary, survived. For Henry, this was not enough. The laws of succession were fragile, and the memory of civil war still haunted England. A son was needed, not only to secure the dynasty, but to project stability to a nation still recovering from the Wars of the Roses. As the years passed, Henry's anxiety deepened. Court life grew tense, shadowed by the king's mounting frustration. Advisors whispered of alternatives, of new alliances and new wives. The Queen, once cherished, now stood in the path of Henry's ambition. It was this personal longing, this desperate need for a son, that would ignite a storm. In seeking to set aside Catherine, Henry would confront not just personal obstacles, but the entire weight of European religious authority. Sometimes, empires turn on the smallest hinges of human desire, and so it was that Henry's private wish became the spark for a transformation that would send waves across the kingdom and beyond. The break with Rome. In Henry's time, the Pope was not merely a distant figure, he was the supreme head of Christendom, a spiritual authority whose word shaped the fate of kings and nations. For centuries, England, like much of Europe, had walked in the shadow of Rome. To defy the Pope was unthinkable, yet that is precisely what Henry would do. Henry sought an annulment of his marriage, arguing that his union with Catherine was cursed, that divine displeasure had prevented the birth of a male heir. Yet the Pope, entangled in political alliances and wary of angering Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused. For Henry, this refusal became a challenge to his sovereignty. How could a foreign cleric hold sway over England's throne? How could the spiritual needs of the realm be dictated from afar? As negotiations stalled, Henry's resolve hardened. Around him, a circle of reform-minded advisors gathered, urging a bold course. Chief among them was Thomas Cromwell, a man of sharp intellect and relentless drive. Together, they charted a path that would sever centuries of tradition. In 1533, Henry acted. He married Anne Boleyn, already pregnant with their child, without papal approval. Parliament, under Henry's influence, passed acts asserting the king's authority over religious matters within England. The stage was set for an irrevocable break. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. No longer would Rome dictate the spiritual life of the nation. With one bold stroke, England cast itself adrift from the Catholic fold. Yet in this break lay not just a rejection of Rome, but a new freedom. England began to see itself as sovereign, not only in faith, but in fate. No longer merely a part of Catholic Europe, it stood as a realm apart, charting its own spiritual and political course. The consequences would unfold slowly, but already the winds of change stirred. A nation unbound had begun to imagine new possibilities, both at home and across the seas. New church, new power. With the passing of the Act of Supremacy, a profound shift took place. The crown, once the guardian of temporal power, now claimed dominion over the soul. This fusion of church and state would reshape the character of England and provide a new engine for its imperial ambitions. Henry, ever mindful of authority, wasted no time in consolidating this power. Monasteries, long the bastions of Catholic wealth and influence, came under royal scrutiny. The great dissolution of the monasteries began, stripping these institutions of land, treasure, and standing. The proceeds enriched the crown and its allies, but also served a deeper purpose: breaking the old religious order and elevating the new. The Church of England, though outwardly similar in ritual to its Catholic predecessor, was now firmly under the king's control. Bishops owed their loyalty to the crown. Doctrine was shaped not in distant councils, but by royal decree. This new structure carried with it a moral certainty, a belief that England's destiny was divinely ordained. Monarchs henceforth would see themselves not merely as rulers, but as God's chosen instruments. Their policies would be infused with a sense of spiritual mission, a conviction that their actions served both crown and creator. Such power could inspire noble aims, but also ruthless ones. The marriage of church and state gave future rulers both a sword and a shield. Conquests could be framed as acts of divine justice. Colonies could be justified as fields for the spread of true faith. The seeds of imperial ideology were thus planted. England's future ventures would not be driven by commerce alone, but by a vision of moral purpose. The new church looked outward, its gaze extending beyond the island's shores. In this fusion of spiritual and temporal authority, the crown found both strength and license. The nation, now sovereign in faith, was poised to seek sovereignty in other realms as well. Imperial seeds. Even as the Church of England took root, the tides beyond the island whispered of larger dreams. The sea, restless and vast, beckoned to a nation newly aware of its independence. And with this call came a new vision of empire, shaped not only by steel, but by scripture. The Reformation had given England a distinct identity, no longer tethered. To Rome, it began to see itself as a beacon of true faith. This sense of mission soon intertwined with the practical aims of trade and expansion. English sailors and merchants, now venturing farther afield, carried with them more than goods. They carried the creed of the new church. Missionary zeal accompanied commerce. Explorers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh would, in time, speak not only of riches, but of spreading English faith and values. The cross sailed with the flag. In these early days, such ambitions were still forming, yet the foundation had been laid. The church's reach extended beyond parish and cathedral. It spoke of a divine mandate for England to bring its vision of truth to distant lands. This marriage of commerce and creed would shape the character of the British Empire. Colonization would be framed not merely as economic gain, but as a moral endeavor. Settlements would include churches alongside fortifications. Missionaries would follow merchants, seeking to win souls as well as markets. The imperial seeds planted in Henry's time would bear fruit in generations to come. What had begun as one man's quest for a male heir had become a force reshaping the nation's destiny. England, now sovereign in faith, looked outward with new purpose. The sea was calling, and the empire to come would sail beneath banners of both power and piety. The journey was only beginning. Chapter 8: The Empire at Sea, the Age of Privateers. Empires do not always begin with armies on distant shores. Sometimes they begin with sails on the wind, and with bold men willing to risk everything for fortune and glory. In the late 16th century, England's dreams of empire were still fragile. The kingdom remained smaller, poorer, and less experienced at sea than its great rival, Spain. Spanish ships sailed home from the New World, heavy with gold and silver, filling the coffers of the Habsburg crown. Their galleons, thick with treasure, were symbols of a global power at its height. England, by contrast, lacked such riches, but it did not lack ambition. Queen Elizabeth I, ruling with both caution and cunning, understood the realities of her kingdom's strength. A full-scale navy was costly, and open war with Spain dangerous. But there was another path, one that carried risk but also great reward. Across the ports of Devon and Cornwall gathered a new breed of mariner, privateers. These were not pirates in the lawless sense, but seamen who sailed under the Queen's blessing. With official letters of marque, they were licensed to attack and plunder the ships of England's enemies, particularly those of Spain. In return, a portion of the captured wealth would flow back to the crown. Among these so-called sea dogs were names that would echo through history: John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, and most famously, Francis Drake. These men were merchants and warriors, navigators and adventurers. Their ships flew the flag of England, but their sails caught the scent of gold. For Elizabeth, the privateers were a strategic weapon. They harassed Spanish trade, disrupted imperial lifelines, and filled English treasuries, all without the cost of maintaining a vast standing fleet. Moreover, their exploits stirred national pride. In taverns and marketplaces, stories of daring raids and captured treasure spread, weaving a narrative of English boldness on the high seas. Through these sanctioned acts of piracy, England began to test the waters of empire. The Atlantic, once dominated by Spanish and Portuguese ships, now saw the Red Cross of St. George flying from swift English vessels. The sea had become a stage, and the actors, though rough and reckless, were forging a new identity for their kingdom. A voyage around the world. Amid these rising ambitions, one voyage would stand above all others. A journey that would shrink the map of the known world and expand England's sense of what was possible. In 1577, Queen Elizabeth entrusted Francis Drake with a bold mission. Officially, he was to sail for trade and exploration. Unofficially, his orders carried a sharper edge: to raid Spanish holdings and gather intelligence on distant lands. Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, slipped from Plymouth with a small fleet. As the sails unfurled and caught the wind, few could have imagined the odyssey that lay ahead. The voyage was one of peril from the start. Crossing the Atlantic, Drake navigated the treacherous waters of the Strait of Magellan, a narrow, twisting passage at the tip of South America. Here, storms howled and waves towered. One by one, ships were lost or turned back. Only the Golden Hind pressed on, emerging into the vast Pacific, a sea then largely uncharted by Europeans. Drake sailed north along the coast of South America. Spanish settlements, unsuspecting, became targets. Treasure ships were seized. Coastal towns raided, but these acts were more than piracy. They were acts of exploration and daring. Pushing further north in search of new routes and lands, Drake reached the coast of what is now California, claiming it for England as New Albion. Then, in a feat of endurance and navigation, he crossed the Pacific, reaching the Spice Islands of the East Indies. From there, the Golden Hind rounded the Cape of Good Hope and made the long voyage home. In 1580, after nearly 3 years at sea, Drake returned to England, the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. The impact was profound. His voyage proved that English ships could sail anywhere, that no sea was beyond their reach. The world had become smaller in imagination, and England bolder in ambition. The tale of Drake's journey spread like wildfire, inspiring future explorers and privateers alike. The sea was no longer a distant frontier. It was England's new domain. Spanish gold, English dreams. Each returning privateer brought more than treasure. They brought a transformation of English dreams. Gold and silver from captured Spanish galleons flowed into English ports, igniting both greed and vision. Shipyards in coastal towns thrived. With newfound wealth, they built faster, stronger vessels. Skilled shipwrights refined designs, crafting ships that could outrun and outgun their rivals. Merchants invested eagerly, funding new expeditions in hopes of rich returns, but the effects were not limited to industry. The successes of the Sea Dogs stirred a wider cultural change. England, long a kingdom of land and tradition, was becoming a nation of the sea. In ballads and plays, the exploits of Drake and his fellow privateers were celebrated. The sea became a symbol of freedom and possibility. At court, Elizabeth balanced diplomacy with bold action. Publicly, she denied sanctioning piracy. Privately, she welcomed the treasure and the disruption of Spanish power. The English treasury swelled with the spoils of the sea, funding not only further expeditions but also strengthening the nation's defences. Yet with each captured galleon, tensions with Spain grew. Philip II, King of Spain, regarded England's privateers as little more than criminals. The flow of English raids threatened the very foundations of the Spanish Empire. War loomed ever closer on the horizon. For England, however, the momentum was irresistible. Success bred ambition. The dream of empire, once faint, now shimmered with new intensity. The sea was no longer just a highway for raiders. It was becoming a pathway for colonists, merchants, and missionaries. A potent spell had been cast. Greed and glory wove together, driving a rising sea power toward a future where its ships would cross every ocean and touch every shore. A nation transformed by the sea. By the end of the 16th century, England stood transformed. The kingdom that had once looked inward now looked outward with unbridled ambition. The sea had changed the nation's very character. No longer merely a realm of castles and countryside, England had become a kingdom of ships. From the great port of London to the smallest coastal village, the rhythms of maritime life pulsed through the land. Sailors, merchants, and adventurers walked the streets. Dockyards rang with the sounds of hammer and saw. The privateers had blazed a trail, but now others followed. Explorers charted new lands. Merchants sought distant markets. Colonists prepared to plant the English flag on foreign soil. The idea of England as an island alone was fading. In its place emerged a vision of an empire linked by the sea. Elizabeth herself became a symbol of this maritime transformation. Her reign, marked by the exploits of the Sea Dogs and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, fostered a national identity steeped in seafaring pride. The sea promised not only wealth, but destiny. English maps, once focused on the narrow world of Europe, now stretched across oceans. The island nation had found its element, the wind in its sails, the world before it. As the century turned, the foundations of a global empire had been laid. England stood poised to expand its reach, driven by commerce, by faith, and by an unquenchable thirst for adventure. The privateers, with all their daring and ruthlessness, had played their part. They had transformed the sea from barrier to bridge, from mystery to opportunity. And in doing so, they had transformed England itself. The kingdom of ships had been born. The age of empire had begun. Chapter 9: Clash of Empires, the Spanish Armada. Some battles are fought with swords and cannons. Others are waged first in silence, in the long pause before the clash, when fear and hope mingle in the minds of a nation. So it was in the Sul, year 1588, when the Great Spanish Armada set sail for England. The roots of the conflict ran deep. For years, England and Spain had circled one another in a widening spiral of hostility. Religious divides fanned the flames. Protestant England stood apart from the great Catholic powers of Europe, chief among them Spain. The exploits of English privateers had further stoked tensions, raiding Spanish treasure fleets with growing boldness. But it was the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587 that finally snapped the last thread of caution. Philip II of Spain, already enraged by English interference in the Netherlands and emboldened by a sense of divine mission, resolved to bring England to heel. The invasion would be no mere punitive strike. It would be a crusade to crush heresy and restore Catholic rule. In Spanish ports, ships gathered. The Armada, an immense fleet of galleons, supply vessels, and warships, took form. Alongside them, soldiers mustered for the coming campaign. The plan was ambitious. The Armada would sail to the English Channel, link with Spanish forces in Flanders, and land a powerful army on English soil. As word of the Armada's approach spread, England held its breath. Villages and cities alike prepared for invasion. Beacons were ready to light the warning across the countryside. In churches, prayers rose with each tide, seeking deliverance from the storm to come. England's defences rested upon fragile wooden hulls and the uncertain favour of the winds. Its navy was smaller and less experienced than Spain's vast fleet. Yet in the harbours of Plymouth and beyond, captains and crews stood ready. Among them were men like Sir Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and Charles Howard, seasoned mariners, who knew the sea's shifting moods. As the summer of 1588 unfolded, the storm gathered. Across the narrow waters of the Channel, two empires prepared to clash. And the fate of England seemed poised upon the edge of a wave. The dance of fire and wind. When the Armada finally came into view, it appeared as a moving wall upon the sea, vast and imposing, its crescent formation stretching across the horizon. To those watching from the cliffs of southern England, it seemed an unstoppable force. Yet the battle that followed would prove that size alone does not ensure victory. The English fleet, though smaller, possessed key advantages. Their ships were faster, more maneuverable, and armed with long-range cannons. Their captains favoured daring over rigidity, skill over sheer might. As the Spanish advanced up the Channel, the English shadowed them, striking swiftly and retreating before the Armada could bring its heavy guns to bear. Day after day, the two fleets engaged in running skirmishes. English ships darted in and out of range, their cannon fire chipping away at the Spanish line. But it was in the harbour of Calais that the tide would turn. There, the Armada anchored to rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army, a crucial juncture in the invasion plan. The English seized the moment. Under cover of night, they launched fireships, vessels packed with pitch, tar, and explosives, set ablaze and sent drifting toward the anchored Spanish fleet. Panic spread among the Spaniards. To avoid the flames, they cut anchor and scattered into the open sea. The Armada's tight formation was broken, its discipline shaken. In the chaos that followed, English ships pressed the attack. The battle became a ballet of flame and fury upon the restless waves. Cannon smoke curled into the sky. Splintered masts and broken hulls marked the sea's surface. Yet even as English guns roared, nature played its part. The winds, long fickle allies of the islanders, now turned against the Spaniards. Forced northward by storms and unable to regroup, the Armada's proud fleet began a desperate retreat. In those tense days, the sea itself seemed to conspire with England. What had begun as a fearsome invasion now unravelled beneath a dance of fire and wind, a testament to courage, cunning, and the ever-changing moods of the deep. Victory and vigilance. When the storm-scattered Armada limped home, its battered remnants spoke of both the scale of the Spanish ambition and the depth of their defeat. Of the 130 ships that had sailed from Spain, barely half returned. Thousands of sailors and soldiers were lost to battle, shipwreck, and disease. In England, the victory was cause for celebration, but not for complacency. The threat had not vanished entirely. Spanish power remained formidable, and England's position in the world was still precarious. Yet a vital lesson had been learned. Freedom and survival would come not from towering fortresses or fixed defences, but from mastery of the waves. The sea had proven England's shield and sword alike. The navy, once a secondary arm of the crown, now stood as the kingdom's first line of defence and a symbol of its growing strength. The triumph of 1588 reshaped English thinking. Naval power became a national priority. Investment flowed into shipbuilding and maritime innovation. A generation of sailors and captains, forged in the fires of the Armada, carried forward hard-earned wisdom. Equally important was the cultural shift. The English people, once divided by religious strife and wary of foreign adventure, now rallied around a shared sense of identity. The sea, so long a barrier, had become a unifying force, a realm where English courage and skill had prevailed. In the years that followed, vigilance remained constant. Raids and counter-raids continued. The Channel remained a contested space, but the myth of Spanish invincibility had been broken. England had stood against the might of Catholic Europe and emerged unbowed. The memory of that summer would linger, in song and story, in the pride of sailors and the resolve of the crown. The age of English mastery at sea had begun, and with it, the shape of a future empire grew ever clearer on the horizon. An empire's destiny confirmed. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military victory. It was a turning point in England's sense of itself and its destiny. The small island that had once looked inward now gazed outward with new confidence. The battle had confirmed a truth that would guide England's ambitions for centuries to come. The sea was its true domain. Where land empires might rise and fall, an empire of the waves could endure, unbound by borders and beyond the reach of any single foe. Emboldened by success, English mariners ventured further. Trade routes expanded. Colonies were envisioned in distant lands. The English flag began to appear in waters once ruled by Spain and Portugal. The spirit of the sea dogs lived on, now woven into a broader vision of empire. Commerce, exploration, and faith sailed hand in hand. The nation's shipyards rang with the sound of hammers forging the vessels that would carry England's hopes across the globe. At home, the crown and people alike embraced the promise of maritime power. The English navy became not just a tool of defense, but an instrument of expansion. With each voyage, the dream of empire grew more tangible. Few now dared doubt England's potential. The Armada's defeat had proven that a determined people, guided by skilled leadership and a mastery of the sea, could defy even the greatest of powers. The world had changed, and England stood ready to shape its course. As the century turned, the island kingdom looked beyond its familiar shores. The tides carried with them the whispers of new horizons. An imperial destiny beckoned. Bold, uncertain, and irresistible, the sea had called, and England had answered. The age of empire was no longer a dream. It was a course set upon the waves, its sails filled with the winds of victory. Chapter 10. The First Colonies. Every empire begins with dreams, and in those dreams lie both triumph and tragedy. For England, the first steps toward a New World empire began with one such dream, a fragile hope carried across the vast Atlantic. Into the late 16th century, inspired by the exploits of privateers and the defeat of the Spanish Armada, England looked westward with new ambition. The Americas, rich in promise yet fraught with peril, beckoned. Queen Elizabeth granted a charter to Sir Walter Raleigh to establish a colony in North America. In 1585, the first group of settlers landed on Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. It was a daring venture, far from England's shores, amid unknown lands and uncertain allies. The first attempt faltered, the colonists returning home. But Raleigh, undeterred, tried again. In 1587, a new group of over 100 settlers, including women and children, sailed to Roanoke. They arrived with hope, but also faced hardship from the start. Supplies were scarce, relations with native peoples strained, and the threat of Spanish attack lingered. Their governor, John White, returned to England to seek more aid, leaving behind his daughter and newborn granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. But fate intervened. War with Spain delayed White's return for 3 long years. When he finally reached Roanoke in 1590, the settlement was empty. The houses stood abandoned, weathered by time. There was no sign of struggle or mass flight. Only one clue remained. The word Croatoan carved into a tree, a cryptic message pointing to a nearby island. No trace of the settlers was ever found. Their fate remains one of history's great mysteries, a whispered ghost story of a vanished colony. For England, Roanoke was a harsh lesson. The dream of empire, it learned, could be as fragile as a child's first steps. The vastness of the high, new world held both promise and danger. Success would demand more than courage. It would demand endurance, resilience, and a willingness to learn from failure. Virginia and the struggle to survive. Despite the haunting loss of Roanoke, England's gaze remained fixed upon the New World. The promise was too great to abandon. In 1606, King James I granted a new charter to the Virginia Company, a group of investors determined to establish a lasting English presence in America. In December of that year, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, set sail from London carrying 104 settlers. Their destination, the Chesapeake Bay. In May 1607, the settlers arrived at a site along the James River, naming it Jamestown in honor of their king. The land was chosen for defense, but its swampy terrain bred disease. The brackish water was unfit to drink. Mosquitoes swarmed, and as the summer heat rose, so too did the colonists' suffering. From the start, survival was a desperate struggle. Many of the settlers were unprepared for the harsh realities of colonial life. They faced starvation, illness, and conflict with the native Powhatan peoples. Of the original group, more than half perished in the first year. Leadership proved vital. Captain John Smith, though often a divisive figure, enforced discipline and forged uneasy relations with local tribes. His famous words, "He who does not work shall not eat," became a harsh truth in the struggling colony. Yet nature remained a relentless enemy. The winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, brought the colony to the brink of collapse. Trapped by hostile forces and unable to secure food, the settlers resorted to desperate measures. When spring arrived, only about 60 of the 500 colonists remained alive. But Jamestown did not fall. Reinforcements and supplies arrived from England, breathing life into the battered settlement. Slowly, through sheer endurance, the colonists began to lay the roots of England's first lasting foothold in America. Their survival was not a tale of grand conquest, but of quiet perseverance Amid the mud, hunger, and fear, a fragile hope endured, a determination to build where so many others had failed. The tobacco economy. As Jamestown struggled to find its footing, a bitter leaf would change its fate and bind its destiny to darker forces. Tobacco, long used by native peoples, had become a prized commodity in Europe. Its demand grew swiftly, and fortunes awaited those who could supply it. In 1612, John Rolfe, a young English settler, began experimenting with a sweeter strain of tobacco from the West Indies. The results were remarkable. Soon, fields of tobacco spread across the Virginia colony. The crop thrived in the region's climate and soil. By 1614, Rolfe shipped the first successful cargo to England, where it fetched high prices. Tobacco had transformed Jamestown's prospects. With this newfound prosperity came expansion. Land was cleared and plantations established. The Virginia Company saw its investment begin to pay dividends. More settlers arrived, drawn by the promise of wealth. Yet tobacco's success carried a heavy price. The labor-intensive crop demanded a growing workforce. At first, indentured servants filled the need, poor Europeans who worked in exchange for passage to America. But this system soon gave way to a darker one. In 1619, the first recorded Africans were brought to Virginia, sold as laborers. Though their status was initially ambiguous, the roots of racial slavery had been planted. Over time, the colony's prosperity would become inseparable from this cruel institution. Tobacco had saved Jamestown from failure, but it had also bound the colony to a system of exploitation that would cast a long shadow over the empire. Still, for many in England, the colony's success was proof that the imperial dream was possible. The bitter leaf had turned struggle into survival, and survival into profit. The empire had found its first foothold, though at a moral cost that would echo through the ages. Glimmers of permanence. Through hard lessons and fragile treaties with native peoples, Jamestown endured. It was not a harmonious coexistence. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy shifted between uneasy peace and open conflict. Land hunger drove settlers ever outward, straining fragile accords. Yet, amid the challenges, signs of permanence emerged. In 1619, the colony established the House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in English America. Though limited in power, it marked a step towards self-governance and a model that future colonies would follow. Family life began to take root. The arrival of women settlers encouraged the growth of stable households. Children born in the colony would know no other home. The dream of an English presence in America was no longer a distant vision. It was becoming a living reality. Trade expanded. Ships sailed more regularly between Virginia and England, carrying tobacco and other goods. The rhythms of life, once so precarious, began to settle. Yet danger remained ever near. Disease, conflict, and the harsh demands of colonial life continued. To claim lives, treaties were fragile, often broken by ambition or misunderstanding. The land itself remained a source of both promise and peril. Still, Jamestown had survived. Against all odds, it had weathered famine, war, and uncertainty. Its endurance marked a turning point. England's colonial dream was no longer a fantasy, but a force, one that would shape the future of the empire. From these humble beginnings, an expansive vision would grow. New colonies would follow. The Atlantic world would draw England ever deeper into its web. And in the fields of Virginia, beneath the leaves of tobacco swaying in the wind, the first glimmers of a transoceanic empire could be seen. Fragile, yet persistent, a testament to both human ambition and the costs that came with it. Chapter 11. The Caribbean Crucible. To the first English eyes that gazed upon the Caribbean, it must have seemed a paradise beyond imagining. The sea shimmered with endless shades of blue. Gentle winds carried the scent of salt and flowers. Islands rose from the water like emerald jewels, fringed with white sands and crowned with green forests. Yet beneath this beauty lay a harsh and unforgiving reality. The Caribbean would become a crucible for England's growing empire, a place where wealth was wrested from the land at terrible human cost. In the early 17th century, as England sought to expand its colonial reach, the Caribbean drew increasing attention. Spain had long claimed dominion over the region, but its hold was incomplete. English privateers had already plied these waters in search of Spanish treasure. Now, colonists came with new ambitions: to settle, to cultivate, and to profit. At first, the islands offered little of obvious value. Gold and silver eluded the English settlers. Survival was difficult. Tropical diseases, malaria, yellow fever, and more, struck down newcomers with grim regularity. Supplies from England were unreliable, early settlements struggled, and some failed entirely. But one crop would change everything: sugar. Introduced to the Caribbean from Europe and Asia, sugarcane thrived in the island's climate. Its cultivation required land, labor, and relentless effort, but the rewards were immense. In Europe, demand for sugar soared. It sweetened tea, flavored desserts, and soon became a staple of daily life. As the sugar trade grew, the islands transformed. Forests were cleared for plantations. Vast fields of cane stretched to the horizon. Refineries processed the raw crop into valuable crystals bound for English markets. Yet this prosperity came at a terrible price. The labor required to sustain the sugar economy was brutal and unending. European indentured servants proved ill-suited to the climate and the demands of plantation life. Mortality was high. The answer, in the eyes of many planters, lay in the transatlantic slave trade. Human lives became the currency of empire. The Caribbean, once a vision of paradise, became a place of suffering, where the pursuit of sugar turned beauty into a living hell for many. The slave trade. At the heart of England's Atlantic Empire lay a dark and monstrous engine: the transatlantic slave trade. It was a system that reduced human lives to cargo, binding entire continents in a web of cruelty and profit. The so-called triangular trade was simple in form, but vast in scope. English ships sailed from ports like Liverpool and Bristol, laden with manufactured goods. These goods were exchanged on the African coast for enslaved men, women, and children, often acquired through local conflicts and coercion. The captives were then forced aboard slave ships for the journey across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage. It was a voyage of misery beyond words. Shackled in cramped holds, stripped of dignity and hope, the enslaved faced disease, starvation, and abuse. Mortality rates were appalling. Many perished before ever reaching the Caribbean. For those who survived, the ordeal had only begun. Upon arrival, they were sold at market, their lives and labor claimed by plantation owners. Families were torn apart. Cultural identities were shattered. On the sugar plantations of islands like Barbados and Jamaica, the enslaved toiled from dawn to dusk under the lash. The work was grueling. Cutting cane, feeding the fires of refineries, hauling heavy loads. The tropical heat and brutal conditions claimed many lives. Yet the profits blinded many to the moral abyss they had entered. Sugar wealth enriched English merchants and fueled the empire's growth. In London, Grand houses rose on the backs of Caribbean labor. Tea sweetened with sugar became a symbol of civility, even as the trade that supplied it was anything but. Not all were indifferent. Voices of protest began to stir in England, though they remained faint amid the chorus of commerce. For now, the system persisted, a stain upon the empire that grew deeper with each passing year. The slave trade was not incidental to England's Caribbean enterprise. It was integral, a shadow that would haunt the empire long after the last cane was cut. Barbados and Jamaica. Among the many islands of the Caribbean, two would stand at the center of England's imperial fortunes: Barbados and Jamaica. These small lands became engines of astonishing wealth and unspeakable suffering. Barbados was the first to rise. Settled by the English in 1627, it quickly transformed into a sugar colony. The island's soil proved ideal for cane. Within a generation, plantations covered the landscape. At first, labor came from indentured servants, poor Europeans seeking opportunity, but the brutal demands of sugar production soon drove planters to seek a more permanent workforce. Enslaved Africans were imported in growing numbers. By the mid-17th century, the enslaved outnumbered free settlers many times over. Plantation. Life was harsh beyond measure. The enslaved worked under constant threat of violence. Disease and injury were rampant. Life expectancy was tragically short. Yet the system persisted, because the profits were immense. Ships departed Barbados, laden with sugar, rum, and molasses. In England, merchants grew rich. The island's success became a model for other colonies. In 1655, England seized Jamaica from Spain. The island would soon surpass even Barbados in importance. Vast plantations rose, feeding the hunger of European markets. Jamaica's economy was built upon the same cruel foundation. Enslaved Africans provided the labor. Their resistance, through rebellion, escape, and cultural resilience, became an enduring part of the island's story. Yet the planters' wealth seemed to blind them to the human cost. The rhythms of the island were governed by the sugar harvest. Each ship that sailed from Kingston or Port Royal carried not only cargo, but the echoes of lives broken and bent to serve imperial ends. In the parlours of London and Bristol, sugar-sweetened tea and cakes, few paused to consider the suffering that made such luxuries possible. Barbados and Jamaica became symbols of both the empire's reach and its moral decay. Islands of promise for some, islands of pain for many more. A shadow on the empire even. As sugar wealth flowed into England, not all voices remained silent. Amid the tide of greed, a current of conscience began to stir. Religious groups, particularly the Quakers, spoke out against the slave trade and the cruelty of plantation life. Their writings and sermons called attention to the humanity of the enslaved and the moral cost of empire. Some former sailors and merchants, haunted by what they had witnessed, joined the cause. Accounts of the Middle Passage, of the horrors endured aboard slave ships, began to circulate. Yet for now, such voices were few. The machinery of empire was vast and profitable. Many in positions of power were unwilling to confront the truths that lay beneath their wealth. Still, the seeds of change had been planted. Over time, they would grow, watered by courage and conviction. In the Caribbean, the enslaved themselves resisted in ways both large and small. Maroon communities, formed by those who escaped bondage, took root in the rugged interiors of islands like Jamaica. Their defiance became a beacon of hope. Cultural traditions endured. Songs, stories, and faith crossed the sea from Africa, taking new forms amid the plantations. In the face of dehumanization, the enslaved preserved their spirit. For England, the Caribbean was a crucible, a place where imperial ambition met human suffering. The wealth gained came at an incalculable moral cost. The shadow of slavery would haunt the empire for generations to come, and yet, amid the darkness, voices of conscience began to rise. A reckoning lay ahead, one that would challenge the very foundations of empire. For now, however, the islands of sugar continued to sweeten English tea and darken the empire's soul. Chapter 12. India, Jewel of the Crown. In the early dawn of empire, the dreams of England's merchants sailed eastward. Across the restless seas, past the windswept shores of Africa, lay India, a land that seemed to shimmer in the imagination, with the promise of wealth beyond measure. For centuries, tales of India's riches had stirred the minds of European traders. Spices, silks, precious stones, the products of the East had long commanded high prices in Western markets. The overland routes to India, controlled by rival empires, were costly and dangerous. But with the rise of seaborne exploration, a new path opened, one that would carry England's ambitions ever deeper into the heart of Asia. At first, the English came not as conquerors, but as traders. The year was 1600 when Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the East India Company, a joint stock enterprise with the right to trade in the East. Its first ships, laden with woolens and silver, set sail with hope and trepidation. India was no empty land awaiting foreign influence. It was the heart of the great Mughal Empire, a realm of dazzling splendor and formidable power. Cities like Agra, Delhi, and Lahore thrived as centers of culture and commerce. The Mughal court, rich in ceremony and sophistication, welcomed European traders, but on its own terms. English merchants established small trading posts, known as factories, along the coast. At Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, they sought footholds from which to conduct their business. They traded textiles, spices, and luxury goods. The company's early agents navigated a complex web of local politics and rival European interests, particularly those of the Portuguese and Dutch. Yet even in these first cautious dealings, the seeds of empire were being sown. The company's charter granted not only trading rights, but also the power to negotiate treaties, maintain armed forces, and build fortifications. The line between commerce and conquest was already beginning to blur. What began as a journey for silks and spices would in time become something far greater and far darker. Trade would give way to rule, and the distant land that had lured England's ships would become the jewel of its growing crown. From trade post to power. The story of England's rise in India is not one of sudden conquest, but of gradual encroachment, a steady accumulation of influence and control that unfolded over decades. At first, the East India Company remained a guest within the Mughal realm, its factories operating with the emperor's permission. But as the Mughal Empire began to weaken in the 18th century, the balance of power shifted. Regional rulers, known as Nawabs, grew more independent. The company seized this opportunity. With money and muskets, the company forged alliances with local leaders. It offered military support in exchange for trading privileges and territorial concessions. Deals were struck in silk-draped courts, agreements sealed with gold and promises. Yet behind these polite negotiations lurked the threat of force. The company's private armies, once small detachments meant to guard warehouses, grew into formidable forces. British officers trained Indian soldiers, sepoys, who would come to outnumber European troops. The company's influence expanded beyond the coastal enclaves, reaching deep into the subcontinent's interior. Rivalries with other European powers further spurred England's ambitions. The French East India Company, in particular, posed a significant threat. In the Carnatic Wars and other conflicts, the British and French fought proxy battles through their Indian allies. Victory in these struggles enhanced the company's prestige and territorial claims. But the decisive transformation came not through diplomacy alone, but on the bloodied fields of battle. The company, driven by profit and guided by opportunistic leadership, began to assert sovereign powers. British flags replaced native banners. Courts of justice and systems of taxation were established under company control. By the mid-18th century, the East India Company had become a state within a state, a commercial enterprise wielding political and military power. The transition from trader to ruler was nearly complete. Yet this transformation would reach its fullest expression through the actions of one man, Robert Clive, whose victories would forever alter the fate of India and England alike. Clive of India. In the complex and shifting world of 18th century India, few figures loomed larger than Robert Clive. A young clerk turned soldier, Clive's boldness and ambition would stitch India's fate to England's in ways few could have foreseen. Clive arrived in India as a writer, a low-ranking employee of the East India Company, but he soon proved himself in battle during the Carnatic Wars. His daring raids and tactical brilliance earned him rapid promotion. The pivotal moment came in 1757 at the Battle of Placi. The company, embroiled in conflict with the Nawab of Bengal, faced overwhelming odds. Yet Clive, through a blend of military skill and political intrigue, secured victory. He forged secret alliances, bribed key figures within the Nawab's camp, and led his forces with ruthless efficiency. When the battle was done, a handful of British troops and their sepoy allies had defeated a vastly larger army. The Nawab's power was broken, and Bengal, one of India's richest provinces, fell under company control. Placi marked a watershed. It demonstrated that the company could not only trade and negotiate, but dominate and rule. The flow of wealth from Bengal to England intensified. The company's coffers swelled with revenue extracted through taxation and trade. Yet the cost was immense. The people of Bengal suffered under exploitative policies. Famine and poverty spread as the company prioritized profit over governance. The conquest that had enriched England had brought misery to millions. Clive himself returned to England a wealthy and celebrated figure, Clive of India. Yet his legacy was already shadowed by controversy. His actions had bound India's destiny to England's imperial ambitions. The jewel had been clasped, but at what cost? Beneath the glitter of wealth lay the realities of exploitation and control. The conquest of India was not the work of kings and parliaments, but of merchants and soldiers driven by profit. It was an empire built in the counting house as much as on the battlefield, an empire within an empire. As the East India Company's power grew, it took on the trappings of a state. Governors ruled vast territories. Armies enforced company policies. Courts administered justice. Across India, the company governed not in the king's name, but in its own. This was a new model of empire, corporate, calculating, relentless. The company's directors in London set policy, but thousands of miles away, their agents acted with considerable autonomy. The pursuit of profit shaped every decision. Company rule brought some stability to war-torn regions, but it also deepened inequality. Heavy taxation and economic disruption devastated local industries. Traditional structures of power and society were upended. Resistance simmered beneath the surface. In villages and cities, discontent grew. Yet for now, the company's grip remained firm. In Britain, the wealth flowing from India transformed society. Fortunes were made, mansions rose, Indian textiles and spices became staples of British life. Yet few questioned the morality of the system that sustained this prosperity. The company's dominance could not last forever. In time, scandal and rebellion would force the British Crown to take direct control. But in these formative years, the East India Company embodied the empire's ambition and its contradictions. A merchant enterprise ruling over millions. India, the jewel of the crown, had been claimed not by king and country, but by clerks and traders. The story of empire was no longer one of simple conquest, but of commerce entwined with power. As the sun set over the fields of Bengal and the markets of Madras, a new imperial age was dawning, one that would bind India and Britain in a complex embrace for generations to come. Chapter 13: The Atlantic World. The tide of empire did not flow only in distant lands. It surged through England's own harbours, through narrow streets and busy quays, where the pulse of a growing empire could be heard in the clatter of cargo and the cries of sailors. By the 18th century, England's ports had become the lifeblood of its Atlantic enterprise. London, vast and ever-expanding, stood at the centre, its docks crowded with ships from across the seas. Bristol and Liverpool, once provincial towns, now hummed with the commerce of empire. Along the Thames, warehouses brimmed with goods from faraway shores, sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco from Virginia, cotton from India, rum, indigo, spices. The wealth of the world flowed into English hands. The sight of tall masts rising above the docks became commonplace. Sailors from every corner of the Atlantic gathered in taverns and markets, their tales weaving a tapestry of global connection. Merchants and ship owners, once modest figures, rose to prominence, their fortunes built on the rhythms of trade. But beneath this prosperity lay uncomfortable truths. The same ships that carried goods also carried human cargo. The profits of the Atlantic world were stained by the suffering of millions. Yet in the counting houses and boardrooms, few dwelled upon such matters. Gold and goods flowed too freely. The empire's heartbeat quickened with each tide. The Atlantic had become more than a sea. It was an artery of empire, binding England to continents across the globe. And as the sails filled with wind, so too did the ambitions of a nation now seeing itself at the centre of a vast and restless world. The web of trade. The Atlantic world was a web, intricate, far-reaching, and built upon both commerce and cruelty. Across its vast waters sailed ships that bound continents together in a ceaseless exchange of goods, people, and power. At the heart of this web lay the triangular trade. English goods, textiles, firearms, metalware were shipped to the coast of West Africa. There they were exchanged for captives, men, women, and children forced into bondage. The Middle Passage carried these captives across the Atlantic to the plantations of the Caribbean and the Americas. The conditions aboard slave ships were beyond harrowing. Cramped, suffocating holds. Disease, abuse, despair. Many did not survive the voyage. Those who did faced lives of relentless labor and brutality. From the plantations came sugar, rum, and tobacco, commodities that enriched England and fed its growing appetite for luxury and profit. The ships returned to English ports laden with these goods, their holds emptied of human cargo but heavy with the weight of moral compromise. The flow of wealth transformed England. Lavish estates rose in the countryside, grand homes lined the streets of Bristol and Liverpool. London's merchants became powerful figures in both commerce and politics. Yet the human cost of this prosperity remained largely unseen by the public. Below decks and beyond the sea, the suffering of the enslaved was hidden from polite society. The system persisted because it was profitable and because too many chose not to see. The web of trade was not only economic but cultural. It shaped tastes and habits. Sugar sweetened English tea. Tobacco filled gentlemen's pipes. Rum flowed in taverns. The goods of the Atlantic world became woven into the fabric of daily life. And with each passing year, England grew more prosperous and more complicit. The empire's wealth was built upon a foundation of exploitation. The Atlantic world had brought England to new heights, but it had done so at a terrible cost. An uneasy conscience. Amid the clink of coin and the hum of commerce, not all voices were silent. In meeting houses and on printed pages, a different current began to stir. One of conscience, one of protest. The early abolitionist movement found its roots in the moral clarity of a few determined individuals and communities. Among the Quakers, whose faith emphasized equality and the inner light of every person, the horrors of the slave trade could not be ignored. They spoke out in meetings and published pamphlets condemning the practice. Their words spread slowly, carried by networks of dissent. In London and beyond, a small but growing number of thinkers, clergy, and reformers joined the cause. They wrote of the Middle Passage, of the broken lives upon the plantations, of the moral stain upon the nation's soul. Yet for now, their pleas were drowned by the roar of profit. Parliament remained dominated by those with vested interests in the trade. Merchants and ship owners defended the system as essential to the empire's prosperity. Many chose not to question what lay beneath their comforts, but seeds of change had been planted. Public awareness began to grow. Gruesome accounts of the slave ships reached the ears of those who had never before considered the human cost of their sugar and rum. Artists and writers lent their voices to the cause. Campaigners organized petitions. The moral argument against slavery took root in the public mind, though progress would be slow and hard-fought. For now, the tide of commerce carried the day. The profits of the Atlantic world continued to flow. But beneath the surface, conscience stirred. An uneasy undercurrent that would, in time, challenge the very foundations of empire. The web of trade was strong, but so too now was the resolve of those who sought to unmake it. Atlantic identity. As England's ships crisscrossed the Atlantic, they carried not only goods and people, but ideas and identity. The island nation, once inward-looking, now saw itself as the heart of a vast and interconnected world. An Atlantic identity began to take shape, one forged by trade, by empire, by the constant movement of ships and souls across the sea. English. Merchants thought in terms of global markets. Sailors sang songs of distant ports. Families tracked fortunes made and lost in the Caribbean and the Americas. The culture of the nation reflected this reach. Exotic goods filled English homes. News from the colonies shaped politics and public debate. The empire was no longer a distant abstraction. It was part of daily life. Language itself absorbed the rhythms of the sea. Nautical terms entered common speech. The Atlantic became a shared space in the English imagination, a place of opportunity and danger, of wealth and moral ambiguity. Yet this identity was complex. It was built upon both achievement and exploitation. The same empire that brought prosperity also carried the shadow of slavery. The Atlantic world was a realm of contradiction, where commerce and conscience collided. As the 18th century progressed, England's sense of itself as an imperial power deepened. The island no longer stood alone. It was connected by countless threads to lands across the sea. But with this new identity came new responsibilities and new challenges. The voices of abolition would grow louder. The costs of empire would become harder to ignore. For now, however, the Atlantic world remained a source of pride and power. England saw itself not merely as a European kingdom, but as the beating heart of an empire that spanned the ocean's breadth. And beneath the sails and the commerce, the currents of change continued to flow, quiet, steady, and inevitable. Chapter 14: The Empire Fights Back. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire stood at a crossroads. The web of trade stretched wider than ever. Fortunes flowed through English ports, and distant colonies grew in size and ambition. Yet with every gain came rivals, powers eager to challenge England's expanding reach. Foremost among them was France. For decades, the two nations had vied for dominance across Europe, in the Americas, in Asia. Now, the simmering tensions would erupt into open conflict. The 7 Years' War was not merely another European struggle. It would become the first true world war, fought on land and sea, across continents, a reckoning for empires. The war's origins were tangled. In North America, English and French settlers clashed along disputed frontiers. In Europe, old alliances shifted and hardened. In India, the East India Company faced both native powers and French competition. The theatres of war were vast, yet the stakes were simple: control. In 1756, the conflict ignited. Armies marched, fleets set sail. The war would draw in not only Britain and France, but also Spain, Prussia, Austria, and others. Yet for England, two distant arenas would prove decisive: the forests of Canada and the plains of Bengal. At home, the British people watched anxiously. The war promised glory, but also great cost. Taxes rose. Sons sailed for unknown shores. The war's reach was felt in every village, in every household. On the seas, the Royal Navy battled tirelessly. Control of the Atlantic meant control of empire. Merchant convoys sailed under constant threat. Naval victories were celebrated as much for their economic impact as their martial pride. In the colonies, the war unfolded with brutal intensity. From Canada's dense woods to India's fertile plains, soldiers fought not only for land, but for the future shape of the British Empire. Victory would come, but it would be hard won, and it would leave scars. Placi and Quebec. Two battles, fought worlds apart, would shape the destiny of the British Empire. At Placi and Quebec, English forces secured victories that redrew the map of empire. In India, the East India Company's ambitions had long been growing. The decline of the Mughal Empire and the complexities of local politics opened new opportunities, yet French influence remained strong, particularly in Bengal, the richest of India's provinces. Robert Clive, already a seasoned figure in company affairs, prepared for a decisive confrontation. In June 1757, his small force of British soldiers and Indian sepoys faced a much larger army under the Nawab of Bengal at Placi. Through a mix of bold tactics and political intrigue, Clive secured a stunning victory. Key elements of the Nawab's forces defected. The British captured the field. With Placi, the East India Company gained effective control of Bengal, and with it, vast revenues. The battle marked the true beginning of British dominion in India. The company transitioned from trader to ruler. The British flag now flew where once only merchants had ventured. Across the Atlantic, another drama unfolded. In North America, British and French forces clashed for control of Canada. The struggle culminated at Quebec in 1759. General James Wolfe led a daring assault against the fortified city. Scaling cliffs under cover of night, his troops faced a fierce French defense on the Plains of Abraham. The battle was short but decisive. Wolfe himself fell in combat, a martyr to Imperial cause. Yet his forces triumphed. The fall of Quebec signaled the collapse of French power in Canada. Within years, British rule extended across much of North America. Placi and Quebec, battles fought a hemisphere apart, together transformed the British Empire. The Union Jack now waved over new lands. The Empire stood ascendant, but also fragile. Victory had brought expansion, yet with it came new challenges, new responsibilities, and new resentments. A time of heroes and horrors. The victories of the 7 Years' War stirred great pride across England. In London, church bells rang, streets filled with celebration. Generals and admirals were hailed as national heroes. The empire had proven its strength on a global stage. Yet beneath the triumph lay deeper truths of sacrifice, of cost, of the complex nature of imperial war. The war had exacted a heavy toll. Across England, families mourned lost sons. Villages sent forth young men who never returned. The cost in blood was high, and it touched all corners of the kingdom. Financially, too, the war had strained the nation. To fund armies and fleets, Parliament levied new taxes. The national debt soared. The victories had been purchased at great expense. In the colonies, the human cost was no less severe. In North America, native peoples suffered greatly as imperial. Ambitions clashed across their lands. Treaties were broken, territories seized. Indigenous communities faced displacement and violence. In India, company rule brought both opportunity and exploitation. Wealth poured into British coffers, but local populations bore the burden. Famines and economic disruption followed in the wake of conquest. Yet amid the horrors, the narrative of heroism persisted. Figures like Wolfe and Clive were enshrined in popular memory. The war became a symbol of British resolve and imperial destiny. Artists painted grand scenes of victory. Writers extolled the virtues of empire. Public monuments rose. The British people, weary yet proud, embraced their nation's new stature. But pride masked unease. The debts of war lingered. The newly expanded empire presented daunting challenges. Governance, defense, trade, all required attention and resources. And beyond the Atlantic, a new storm was gathering. In Britain's American colonies, whispers of discontent began to rise. The seeds of future conflict were already taking root. For now, however, the nation celebrated. The 7 Years' War had made England the world's foremost imperial power, at least for the moment. Victory and hubris flush with triumph, England seemed unstoppable. From India to the Americas, the empire's reach had grown vast. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. British merchants dominated global trade. In Parliament and the press, voices proclaimed a new era of greatness. The victories of the war had confirmed Britain's status as a preeminent world power. Yet beneath this confidence lay dangers of overreach, of complacency, of hubris. The burdens of empire grew heavier. Administering far-flung territories required new institutions and new expenditures. Military garrisons stretched thin. The costs of defense mounted. In North America, the British sought to consolidate their gains. Yet their efforts to impose new taxes and controls upon the colonies met with resistance. The American colonists, proud of their contributions to the war effort, chafed under imperial policy. Protests began to stir. Pamphlets circulated. The cry of "no taxation without representation" gained force. The very expansion that had seemed such a triumph now brought unforeseen consequences. In India, the East India Company faced its own challenges. Governance proved complex. Corruption and mismanagement sowed unrest. The pursuit of profit clashed with the responsibilities of rule. At home, the war's debts weighed upon the nation. Efforts to raise revenue sparked political debate and public discontent. The glow of victory began to fade beneath the realities of imperial maintenance. Yet many in England remained blind to these undercurrents. The hubris of triumph clouded judgment. Few foresaw that the next imperial crisis was already stirring, one that would test the very fabric of the empire. The 7 Years' War had reshaped the world, but victory bred new vulnerabilities. The British Empire stood at its height and at the threshold of fresh challenges. As ships sailed from English ports, as soldiers garrisoned distant lands, the empire's future hung in the balance. The lessons of war were clear. Whether they would be heeded remained to be seen. The story of the British Empire was far from over. In triumph and in turmoil, the next chapter awaited. Chapter 15: Revolution in the Air. By the close of the 7 Years' War, Britain's empire stood unrivaled in its global reach. From the sunlit shores of India to the dense forests of North America, the Union Jack flew proudly. The Royal Navy ruled the waves. British merchants grew rich on the trade that spanned the Atlantic. Yet beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. Subtle at first, but destined to widen. Across the Atlantic, in Britain's American colonies, a quiet transformation was underway. For more than a century, these colonies had grown in size and confidence. They had cleared forests, built towns, and forged a distinct identity. While loyal to the British Crown, many colonists had come to see themselves not as mere subjects, but as a people apart, with their own interests, their own aspirations. The 7 Years' War had changed the imperial relationship. Britain's victory had secured its colonies from French threat, but at great cost. The war had left the British treasury strained, its debts towering. In London, Parliament sought new revenue. The American colonies, seen as beneficiaries of British protection, were expected to contribute. Yet the methods chosen would ignite deep resentment. New taxes, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, were imposed with little colonial input. To the colonists, this was not merely about money, it was about rights. The principle of no taxation without representation resonated deeply. Colonists feared that distant decrees from Parliament threatened their liberties. Ancient fears of tyranny, once directed at continental monarchs, now found new focus across the sea. Protests erupted. Colonial assemblies issued formal remonstrances. Merchants organized boycotts. In Boston and Philadelphia, tensions simmered. British troops, dispatched to maintain order, only inflamed the situation. The bonds of empire, once strong, began to strain. What had been a proud relationship of loyalty and shared purpose now teetered toward rupture. The winds of change swept across the Atlantic, carrying with them the first stirrings of revolution. Voices of liberty. As tensions rose, so too did the voices of liberty. In taverns, on street corners, in the pages of pamphlets and broadsheets, Americans debated their fate. The air was charged with possibility and danger. Patriots, as they came to be known, argued passionately for the colony's rights. Figures like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry spoke of liberty as a sacred trust, one not to be surrendered to distant rulers. Writers such as Thomas Paine gave voice to these ideals, urging ordinary men and women to embrace the cause of independence. Pamphlets circulated widely. Common Sense, with its plain language and forceful arguments, electrified the colonies. It transformed discontent into determination. The idea of liberty burned bright, a flame England could not extinguish. Yet not all colonists shared this vision. Loyalists, many of them merchants or officials, warned of the perils of rebellion. They spoke of loyalty to crown and country, of the order that empire provided. In families and communities, these debates divided neighbors and friends. Town squares became arenas of heated discussion. In homes and churches, the question of allegiance tore at the fabric of colonial society. The conflict was not only between Britain and its colonies, it was within the colonies themselves. British authorities underestimated the depth of colonial sentiment. They believed that firm action and military presence would restore order. But each new measure, each show of force, only strengthened the resolve of the patriots. Committees of correspondence linked colonies in a web of shared purpose. Militias drilled in village greens. The colonies were preparing, not just for protest, but for resistance. Across the Atlantic, many in Britain failed to grasp the growing fervour. The colonial unrest was viewed as the noise of a few radicals. Few believed that full rebellion was possible, or that it could succeed. Yet the tide of revolution was rising. The voices of liberty rang louder with each passing day. The war for independence. The spark came in the early spring of 1775. British troops, sent to seize colonial arms, marched on the towns of Lexington and Concord. There, on April 19th, musket fire cracked in the morning air. The war was on. At Lexington Green, colonial militia, farmers, tradesmen, ordinary citizens, faced British regulars. The first shots of the American Revolution were fired. Though outmatched, the militia fought fiercely. At Concord's North Bridge, they repelled the British advance. News of the skirmishes spread like wildfire. Across the colonies, men took up arms. The call to defend liberty echoed through the land. What had begun as protest had become open rebellion. The Chai war that followed was unlike any Britain had faced. The vast American wilderness favored the defenders. Supply lines stretched thin across the Atlantic. The British Army, though professional and experienced, faced a determined and resourceful enemy. Under the leadership of George Washington, the Continental Army fought with courage and resilience. Victories were hard won and losses severe. The winter at Valley Forge tested the resolve of the American cause. Yet the spirit of independence endured. Britain, for its part, struggled to adapt. Generals underestimated the will of the colonists. Political leaders in London debated strategy, torn between force and conciliation. The war dragged on. International dynamics shifted the balance. France, eager to humble its old rival, allied with the American cause. French ships and troops entered the fray, turning the conflict into a global struggle. In 1781, the decisive blow was struck at Yorktown. British General Cornwallis, besieged by combined American and French forces, surrendered. The tide had turned. Irrevocably, the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized American independence. For the first time, a British colony had successfully broken free. The war had been a struggle not only for land, but for identity. A new nation was born, forged in the fires of revolution, committed to ideals that would resonate far beyond its borders. For Britain, the loss was profound. The empire had been challenged and found wanting. The first great crack had appeared in its imperial edifice. Lessons unlearned. In the wake of defeat, Britain grappled with the meaning of its loss. The American Revolution had exposed the limits of imperial power, yet many in England failed to heed its lessons. In Parliament and the press, debate raged. Some blamed the war's mismanagement. Others blamed the colonists' ingratitude. Few acknowledged the deeper truth that the bonds of empire must rest upon consent, not coercion. For many, the allure of empire remained undimmed. The British state turned its attention to other colonies in the Caribbean, in India, in Australia. The machinery of imperial expansion continued, yet beneath the surface, the loss of America haunted the national psyche. It marked a turning point, a reminder that even the greatest empires could falter. Voices of reform began to question imperial practices. Could governance be more just? Could colonial subjects be heard, not merely ruled? These questions, though, quietly asked, would shape future debates. But for now, the prevailing belief was that empire would endure. The loss of 13 colonies was seen as an aberration, not a harbinger. The British Empire pressed forward, confident in its resilience. Yet the revolution had revealed a deeper current, the desire of peoples to govern themselves, to shape their own destinies. This current would flow through the centuries to come, challenging the imperial order again and again. For Britain, the road ahead remained one of power and ambition, but the shadow of America's defiance would linger, a silent reminder that no empire is forever. As the sun set on this chapter of history, the story of the British Empire continued, tempered by loss, yet unbroken. New challenges lay on the horizon, and the lessons of revolution, though unlearned, waited patiently to be taught again. Chapter 16. The Victorian Zenith. By the mid-19th century, the British Empire stood astride the world. Under Queen Victoria's long reign, the empire expanded to become the most extensive in human history. Its territories spanned continents and oceans, linked by trade, power, and ambition. A map of the world told the story in bold red. From the jungles of Africa to the outback of Australia, from the icy reaches of Canada to the teeming ports of India, British dominion was nearly everywhere. The phrase became common. The sun never sets on the British Empire. Wherever daylight shone, so too did the Union Jack. Yet such pride masked deeper truths. The empire's reach was vast, but its foundations were complex, a mixture of genuine achievement and raw exploitation. Under the banners of civilization and commerce, many injustices were committed. In London, the heart of the empire beat with unmatched confidence. Parliament debated global affairs. The Queen, a symbol of stability, presided over a nation of immense power. Yet that power rested not only on diplomacy or industry, but on the labor and resources of millions across the empire. For many Britons, the empire was a source of pride and identity. School children learned of distant lands under British rule. Newspapers carried stories of adventure and conquest. The empire was seen as a force for progress, bringing railways, education, and law to less civilized corners of the world. But in the colonies, the experience was often far different. Indigenous peoples faced displacement. Traditional societies were reshaped or destroyed. Economic systems were restructured to serve imperial needs. The Victorian Zenith was real, a moment of global dominance, yet it cast long shadows. The wealth of the empire flowed into Britain, enriching its cities and citizens. But the costs, borne by colonized peoples, were profound and enduring. As the 19th century unfolded, the empire's contradictions would grow ever more apparent. For now, the sun shone brightly, yet not without shadow, steam and steel. If the British Empire was a giant, steam and steel were its sinews. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain, and in turn, it transformed the empire. Railways stitched vast territories together. In India, the construction of a railway network linked distant cities and regions, facilitating the movement of goods and troops. The iron rails represented both progress and control, binding the subcontinent more tightly to British rule. In South Africa and Australia, rail lines pushed into the interior, opening new lands for exploitation and settlement. Steamships plied imperial routes, shrinking oceans and speeding communication. Where once a letter might take months to cross the seas, now news and orders travelled swiftly. The empire became a network, connected not only by political ties, but by the arteries of modern transportation. British engineers and entrepreneurs drove this expansion. Companies built railways, mined resources, and developed ports. Industry fueled empire, and empire in turn fueled industry. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham consumed raw materials from across the globe: cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Malaya, minerals from Africa. The finished products, textiles, machinery, goods of every kind, were exported back to imperial markets. The benefits of this industrialized empire were clear in Britain. Cities boomed, employment grew, consumer goods became more accessible, the middle class expanded, but in the colonies, the picture was more complex. Railways often served imperial rather than local needs, built to transport goods for export rather than to serve indigenous populations. The economic ties bound colonies to British interests, sometimes stifling local industry and self-sufficiency. Moreover, the human cost was high. Workers, often poorly paid and harshly treated, toiled to build the infrastructure of empire. Natural resources were extracted with little regard for environmental or cultural impact. Still, the marvels of steam and steel inspired awe. The Victorian imagination embraced the wonders of progress. Yet beneath the gleaming engines and iron bridges lay deeper questions about who truly benefited from this transformation and at what cost. Exhibitions and illusions. In the great cities of the empire, the triumph of British power was celebrated with grand exhibitions. Nowhere was this more apparent than at the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in London's Crystal Palace. Under a vast canopy of glass and iron, the wonders of the world were displayed. Visitors marvelled at machinery from British factories, at exotic goods from distant lands, at treasures from across the empire. The exhibition was a pageant of imperial pride, a symbol of Britain's global reach. World's fairs followed, each more ambitious than the last. Crowds flocked to these spectacles, eager to witness the empire's bounty. The events reinforced a powerful narrative that Britain ruled a benevolent, progressive empire, bringing light to the world. Yet behind the glittering displays lay more troubling realities. Many of the goods exhibited had been produced through exploitative labor. Colonized peoples often appeared as curiosities, their cultures presented in distorted or patronizing ways. The exhibitions masked the harshness of imperial rule. India, the suppression of the 1857 rebellion had left scars. In Africa, colonial expansion provoked conflicts and displacements. The forced labor and cultural disruption of imperial projects were hidden from view. At home, few questioned the empire's morality. The public narrative remained one of civilizing mission and economic benefit. Critics existed, and their voices would grow louder, but for now they were drowned out by imperial triumphalism. The exhibitions offered illusions. They projected a sanitized vision of empire, omitting its costs and cruelties. The British public, dazzled by spectacle, largely accepted this version of imperial reality. But the cracks were there for those who chose to see. The gleam of progress could not forever obscure the empire's darker truths. Beneath the surface. As the Victorian Empire reached its zenith, not all voices sang its praises. Beneath the surface of public celebration, currents of dissent stirred. In the colonies, resistance took many forms. In India, nationalist movements began to emerge. Writers and activists called for greater rights and representation. In Africa, communities resisted land seizures and labour exploitation. In Ireland, demands for home rule gained momentum. At home too, critics of empire raised their voices. Artists and thinkers questioned the costs of imperial pride. Poets wrote of the human suffering behind the red-stained map. Political reformers argued for greater justice and accountability in colonial governance. The horrors of imperial wars and repression were hard to ignore. Reports of atrocities in places like the Congo, though under Belgian rule, cast a pall over the entire imperial project. British abuses in Kenya, in India, in southern Africa began to reach the public eye. Economic inequality within Britain also bred discontent. While imperial wealth enriched many, large segments of the working class lived in poverty. The moral contradictions of an empire claiming to uplift others while neglecting its own poor became harder to reconcile. Philosophers and religious leaders debated the ethics of empire, the idea of the white man's burden, the supposed duty to civilize, faced growing skepticism. Voices like that of John Ruskin called for moral reflection. Yet for much of the Victorian public, the empire remained a source of pride. Schools taught imperial history as a tale of glory. Newspapers celebrated British victories and acquisitions. The machinery of imperial propaganda was powerful, but beneath the surface, awareness was growing. The costs of empire, human, cultural, and moral, could not be forever hidden. The zenith of Victorian power was real, but so too were the forces that would, in time, challenge and transform it. As the 19th century drew on, the British Empire stood vast and mighty. Yet beneath its grand facade, change was stirring. The voices of dissent would not be silenced. The age of unchallenged imperial pride was nearing its end, and a more complex reckoning lay ahead. Chapter 17: Cracks in the Foundation. In the summer of 1914, the British Empire stood at its height. The red-stained map of imperial dominion stretched across continents. Trade flourished. London, the imperial capital, pulsed with wealth and influence. Few imagined that within months, the entire world would be plunged into war. A war that would test the empire as never before. The assassination of an Austrian archduke in Sarajevo sparked a chain of events that led to global conflict. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, the empire was drawn in by obligation and pride. From every corner of the empire, its sons answered the call. Indians, Australians, Canadians, South Africans, New Zealanders, West Indians. They volunteered or were conscripted to fight in what many believed was a righteous cause. The war was framed as a struggle for civilization against barbarism, for the defense of freedom. In India, over 1 million men would serve. In Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. From the plains of Punjab to the villages of Bengal, families sent their sons to distant battlefields. In Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs sailed to Gallipoli and beyond. Canadians fought with distinction on the Western Front. African soldiers served in campaigns across the continent. The war forged a fragile sense of imperial unity. For a time, colonists and Britons alike stood together beneath the Union Jack. The shared sacrifice was immense. In the trenches of the Somme and Ypres, in the deserts of Mesopotamia, empire's blood was spilled. Yet beneath this unity, tensions simmered. The rhetoric of freedom and democracy rang hollow for many colonial subjects who lived under British rule without equal rights. Promises of reform were made to secure support. Promises that would later prove difficult to fulfill. War deepened colonial grievances. Soldiers returned home with new expectations, new awareness. They had fought and bled for an empire that often denied them dignity. The seeds of change had been sown, even as the guns of war thundered on. Seeds of independence. As the war dragged on, the strains upon the empire grew. The human and economic costs were staggering. Across the colonies, movements for self-determination gained strength. In India, the cry for Swaraj, self-rule, grew louder. Indian leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi, called upon Britain to honour its wartime promises. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919 offered limited political concessions, but they fell short of expectations. Frustration boiled over in acts of resistance. The tragic Amritsar massacre in April 1919, where British troops fired upon unarmed Indian protesters, shocked the world. The event galvanized Indian nationalism, hardening resolve against imperial rule. In Ireland, long-standing demands for independence erupted anew. The 1916 Easter Rising in Dublin, though suppressed, ignited a renewed struggle. In the years that followed, the Irish War of Independence would force Britain to confront its grip over Ireland. Elsewhere, colonial subjects who had served in the war returned with new perspectives. In Africa, veterans became leaders of emerging nationalist movements. In the Caribbean, calls for political reform and economic justice intensified. The ideals proclaimed during the war, democracy, self-determination, freedom, resonated far beyond Europe. Colonial peoples began to claim those ideals for themselves. The contradictions of empire became ever more apparent. British authorities responded with a mix of repression and reform. They sought to maintain control while conceding, just enough to placate dissent. But the tide of independence was rising. A new generation, forged by war and awakened to its own potential, rejected imperial subjugation. The foundations of empire, once so solid, began to crack. The world was changing, and so too would the empire. A changing world. The war ended in 1918, but its aftershocks rippled across the empire. The post-war years brought economic turmoil, political upheaval, and cultural change. The old imperial confidence began to waver. Britain emerged victorious but exhausted. Its economy, strained by years of conflict, struggled to recover. Debt soared. Trade patterns shifted. Industrial unrest rocked British cities. Across the empire, economic hardship bred discontent. In the colonies, the impact was profound. Wartime inflation and economic disruption deepened inequalities. Promises of reform remained unfulfilled. Disillusionment spread. Culturally, the war had shattered many illusions. The brutality of the trenches, the senseless slaughter, had exposed the darker side of modernity. A wave of skepticism swept through art, literature, and public discourse. In Britain, The post-war period saw the rise of new social movements. Women, who had contributed greatly to the war effort, demanded and won greater rights. The Labour Party gained strength, championing workers' causes and questioning imperial policies. In the colonies, nationalist movements gained momentum. In India, Gandhi's campaign of non-violent resistance inspired millions. Mass protests, boycotts, and civil disobedience challenged British authority. In Egypt, nationalist forces demanded independence, leading to partial autonomy in 1922. In Africa and the Caribbean, new voices called for equality and self-rule. The empire still spanned vast territories, but its moral authority was eroding. The old narratives of benevolent rule rang increasingly hollow. The contradictions of empire, its rhetoric of freedom, versus its reality of domination, were harder to ignore. Britain faced a changing world. The war had redrawn political maps and reshaped global consciousness. Anti-colonial sentiments surged. The empire's hold was loosening, though many, in London, refused to see it. The Victorian Zenith was a fading memory. The twilight of empire had begun. The empire. After the war, even as old colonies stirred, the empire paradoxically expanded. Under the League of Nations mandate system, Britain acquired new territories, former German and Ottoman lands, mandates in the Middle East, Palestine, Transjordan, Iraq, added complexity to imperial governance. These territories were ruled under the guise of stewardship, but local populations chafed under foreign control. Administering these new lands strained British resources. In Palestine, conflicting promises to Jews and Arabs sparked unrest. In Iraq, nationalist uprisings challenged British authority. Yet many in Britain viewed the post-war empire with pride. Victory in the Great War seemed to affirm imperial strength. The Union Jack flew over more lands than ever before. But beneath this facade, the empire's vulnerabilities grew. Economic challenges persisted. Political dissent spread. The global tide of self-determination was rising. In India, the movement for independence became unstoppable. The 1930 Salt March, a bold act of civil disobedience, captured global attention. The British response, arrests, crackdowns, only fueled resistance. In Ireland, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 led to the creation of the Irish Free State. Though partitioned, Ireland's partial independence marked a significant imperial retreat. Elsewhere, the seeds of decolonization were sown. Educated elites in colonies demanded greater political voice. Labor unions, youth movements, and nationalist organizations grew stronger. The British government sought to adapt, offering limited reforms while resisting full independence, but the empire's grip was slipping. The interwar years were a time of transition. The empire remained vast, but its foundation was cracked. The illusion of permanent dominion faded. A second world war loomed on the horizon, one that would further reshape the global order. But already, the twilight of empire was deepening. In the quiet corners of the empire, in the speeches of nationalist leaders, in the hopes of colonized peoples, a new world was being imagined. The age of empire was drawing to a close, though its final chapters had yet to be written. Chapter 18: Twilight of Empire. By the dawn of the 1940s, the British Empire remained vast, its territories spanning oceans and continents. Yet beneath the surface, it was already an empire under strain, and soon a global storm would lay bare both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. World War II tested Britain as never before. The rise of fascist powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, plunged the world into darkness. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. Once again, the empire would be called upon. From the furthest reaches of imperial lands, resources and people were drawn into the struggle. Indian troops fought in North Africa and Europe. Australians and New Zealanders defended their homelands and fought across the Pacific. African soldiers served in campaigns in Italy, Burma, and beyond. The Caribbean contributed manpower and material to Britain's war effort. This was a war not only for Britain's survival, but for the fate of its empire. The imperial network became a lifeline. Raw materials, rubber, oil, minerals, flowed to Britain. Colonial troops fought alongside British forces. The unity forged during this time was real, born of shared sacrifice. Yet the war also exposed the empire's fragility. Japanese forces swept through British possessions in Asia. The fall of Singapore in 1942 was a shocking blow, a symbol that British power could no longer be taken for granted. On the home front, British cities endured the Blitz, relentless bombing by the Luftwaffe. Rationing, hardship, and uncertainty became daily realities. The myth of eternal imperial power began to crumble under the weight of global war. The war's rhetoric, too, planted seeds of change. Allied leaders spoke of freedom and democracy, words that resonated deeply in the colonies. How could Britain fight for liberty abroad while denying it at home? As the guns of war finally fell silent in 1945, Britain emerged victorious, but exhausted. Its economy was shattered. Its debts were immense. The war had demonstrated both the empire's strength and its unsustainable burdens. The twilight of empire had begun. The winds of change. With the war's end came a new world, one where the winds of change blew strong. Across the empire, nationalist movements surged. The tide of decolonization was unstoppable. In India, the struggle for independence reached its final phase. The Indian National Congress, under leaders like Gandhi and Nehru, pressed for an end to British rule. The war had only deepened Indian resolve. British promises of post-war reform no longer sufficed. In 1947, after bitter negotiation and the tragedy of partition, India and Pakistan emerged as independent nations. The jewel of the British crown had slipped away, peacefully, yet with enduring scars. In Africa, nationalist voices rose. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah led a campaign that would soon secure independence. Across East Africa, liberation movements gathered strength. The continent's peoples demanded the right to shape their own futures. In the Caribbean, demands for self-government grew. Jamaica and Trinidad would move toward independence within decades. Throughout Asia and the Middle East, the pattern repeated. Burma and Ceylon gained independence. In the Middle East, Britain's influence waned amid nationalist pressures. The process was not always smooth. Some transitions were marred by violence, repression, and civil strife. Yet the broader arc was clear. The age of empire was ending. Within Britain, public opinion shifted. The war had revealed the costs of imperial ambition. A new generation questioned the old imperial narratives. The United States and the Soviet Union, now superpowers, favored decolonization. The geopolitical climate no longer supported the maintenance of empire. As new flags rose where once the Union Jack had flown, a chapter of world history closed. The British Empire, for centuries a dominant force, was dissolving. The winds of change could not be held back. Suez and symbolism. If one moment symbolized the empire's twilight, It was the Suez Crisis of 1956. The events surrounding Suez revealed a harsh truth. Britain could no longer dictate world affairs. The crisis began when Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a vital waterway controlled by British and French interests. In response, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military intervention. The operation initially succeeded. British and French forces captured key positions, yet the political cost was severe. The United States, fearing global instability, pressured Britain to withdraw. The Soviet Union issued stark warnings. Faced with overwhelming diplomatic and economic pressure, Britain backed down. The humiliation was profound. Once a global power able to act unilaterally, Britain now found itself constrained by new realities. Suez marked the end of Britain's role as a dominant imperial power. The illusion of imperial invincibility was shattered. Within the empire, the impact was keenly felt. Nationalist movements took heart. If Britain could be checked on the world stage, it could no longer impose its will on its colonies. At home, Suez sparked soul-searching. The public mood shifted further away from imperial ambition. The British government, recognizing the limits of its power, accelerated the process of decolonization. In the years that followed, waves of independence swept through Africa. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and many others emerged as sovereign nations. Suez had shown that the old imperial playbook no longer applied. Britain's prestige was mortally wounded. Its imperial aura faded. What remained was a nation adjusting to a new role in a changed world, no longer an empire, but a state navigating post-imperial realities. Legacy of an empire. Though the formal empire dissolved, its echoes remained, woven into the fabric of former colonies and of Britain itself. Language stands as one of the most visible legacies. English, once imposed by imperial administrators, became a global language, a medium of commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Legal systems in many former colonies retain elements of British law. Parliamentary democracy, adapted and reshaped, took root in diverse societies. Cultural ties endure. Literature, education, sport, all reflect the shared yet contested history of empire. Cricket fields in India and the Caribbean, legal debates in African courts, literary works across the Commonwealth, all bear the imprint of imperial connections, but alongside these legacies are deeper scars. The disruptions of empire left enduring inequalities. Economic structures often favoured former colonial powers. Cultural erasure and exploitation left wounds that remain sensitive today. In Britain, the imperial past continues to shape national or identity. Debates over colonial history, the legacy of figures like Cecil Rhodes, and the role of empire in British greatness remain contentious. Immigration from former colonies transformed British society. London became a truly global city, enriched by the cultures of its former empire. Yet tensions and struggles over race and identity reflect unresolved aspects of the imperial legacy. The Commonwealth of Nations, while symbolic, offers a forum for continued connection, yet it cannot erase the complexities of the past. In the end, the British Empire reshaped the world, politically, economically, and culturally. Its influence endures in ways both positive and painful. For Britain, the empire shaped its modern self. It forged global ties, brought wealth and responsibility, and left a complex inheritance. As twilight fell on empire, a new world emerged. Former colonies charted their own paths. Britain adjusted to a post-imperial role. The story of empire remains unfinished. its legacies still unfolding in the present day. And so, the long arc of the British Empire, from its small island origins to global colossus to twilight and beyond, comes to rest in history's embrace. A story of ambition, of contradictions, of triumph and tragedy, whose echoes will resonate for generations to come.